Somewhere beneath the gray and sleeping skies of the Commonwealth, small things have always mattered more than anyone expected. The details that nobody planned to remember. The quiet corners that nobody designed to be found. Fallout 4 is built from these quiet corners, from the lamp on a mining helmet that turns on instead of the Pip-Boy light, from the faces drawn inside a Vault Tech lunchbox that most people never think to look for, from a diner sitting above Diamond City that nobody had any reason to climb toward. Tonight we settle into those corners together, drifting gently through the parts of the Commonwealth that exist for no particular reason except to exist. Before you drift any further, maybe tap subscribe for more calming videos, and share where you're watching from tonight. The Commonwealth of Fallout 4 is built from the ruins of Boston, Massachusetts, a city that was already layered with centuries of history before the bombs ever fell. Bethesda chose this location deliberately, knowing that the tangled streets and cramped districts of an old northeastern city would give the wasteland a particular kind of closeness. Every building that ever stood in Boston, every alleyway that ever connected one neighborhood to the next, carries a ghost of itself in the game's geography. The Charles River still curves through the map in roughly the shape it follows in reality, though it glows with a soft, irradiated light now, and the water no longer invites anyone to linger near its banks. The skyline of the Commonwealth reflects the actual Boston skyline in its general proportions. The tall buildings downtown cluster in something like the same arrangement they hold in the real city, scaled and altered to fit the game's needs, but recognizable in their overall silhouette. Bethesda's environment team studied photographs and maps of Boston extensively during development, working to give the ruins a sense of real geographic memory. The result is a wasteland that feels like it was once an actual place, rather than a space designed purely for exploration, and that quiet authenticity gives the world a kind of sadness that a purely invented city could never quite achieve. The name Commonwealth itself carries a particular resonance. Massachusetts has been officially known as the Commonwealth of Massachusetts since long before the bombs fell in Fallout's universe, and the game preserves this designation into the post-war era. In Fallout 4, the term has taken on additional weight, describing not just the geographic region, but the loose and fragmented world that fills it, the settlements, the factions, the wanderers, and all the competing visions of what life in this broken place could eventually become. It is a word with ambition attached to it, which makes it an interesting name for a place where ambition so often ends in rubble. The Institute lives beneath that rubble in a literal sense. The most technologically advanced organization in the entire Commonwealth has built its headquarters underground, accessible only by teleportation or through a very specific chain of story events. The location of the Institute is hidden from the surface world not simply for security reasons, but as a kind of philosophical statement. These are people who have decided that the world above is unsalvageable and that the future must be built in secret, away from the mess and the noise of the wasteland. The underground campus they have constructed is spotlessly clean, brightly lit, and organized into neat divisions devoted to different fields of scientific inquiry. What many players never fully absorb on their first visit to the Institute is the scale of what has been built down there. The campus includes separate wings for biology, cybernetics, advanced systems, and robotics. Each division has its own staff, its own ongoing projects, its own internal politics and rivalries. Scientists debate each other in corridors and break rooms. Research logs discuss experiments in progress. There are personal quarters and recreational areas, suggesting that many of the Institute's residents have never left this underground world and perhaps never plan to. The Institute is not merely a base of operations. It is a self-contained civilization that happens to exist directly beneath the civilization it has chosen to observe and occasionally infiltrate from below. The synths the Institute produces carry their own quiet complexities. Generation 1 and Generation 2 synths are mechanical in appearance, their skeletal frames and glowing eyes giving them away immediately in any encounter. But the Generation 3 synths, the ones that look and feel and behave like human beings, are a different matter entirely. They are grown from organic material, assembled with extraordinary precision, and implanted with memories that give them a complete personal history. And many of them do not know they are synths. They wake each morning in whatever life the Institute has given them, surrounded by people who treat them as the person their memories say they are, with no indication that anything beneath the surface is different from what they believe. The question of whether a Generation 3 synth can be said to truly feel is one that Fallout 4 never answers directly, and that deliberate silence is one of the most interesting things about the game's storytelling. The Railroad faction believes synths are people deserving of freedom and fights to extract them from Institute control and give them new lives with new identities. The Brotherhood of Steel believes synths are machines regardless of how convincingly they simulate humanity and must be controlled or destroyed. The Institute believes synths are tools, no matter how sophisticated, and maintains this position even as individual scientists privately express doubts in terminal entries scattered through the campus. The sole survivor encounters this uncertainty in its most personal form through Nick Valentine, the detective who operates out of Diamond City. Nick is a Generation 2 synth, visibly mechanical, his synthetic frame exposed beneath weathered clothing and a long coat. But his mind contains the copied memories of a pre-war detective named Nick Valentine, a man who lived and worked and loved before the bombs fell. The real Nick Valentine died 200 years ago. What walks the streets of the Commonwealth is a machine carrying that man's memories and personality. Whether this makes the synthetic Nick Valentine the same person, a new person, or no person at all, is a question the game asks and does not answer, and Nick himself carries the uncertainty with a quiet and patient grace that makes him one of the most enduring characters in the entire series. Diamond City was built inside Fenway Park, the famous baseball stadium that stood in Boston's Kenmore Square neighborhood for more than a century before the bombs fell. The stadium walls became the walls of the settlement, their enormous concrete arches and steel supports transformed into a defensive barrier that has kept the city relatively safe from the wasteland outside. Inside those walls, a community of several hundred people has built something that looks almost like a normal town. Shops and houses and a market street and even a mayor's office, all constructed from scrap and salvage but arranged with enough permanence to suggest that the people who built it believed it was going to last. The field itself, the famous green expanse where baseball games were once played to crowds of tens of thousands, has been built over entirely. Houses and market stalls stand where outfielders once ran, and the dirt beneath the settlement still holds the ghost of the diamond that gave the park its most enduring association. The name Diamond City carries a memory of that diamond, a quiet tribute to the game that defined this space for more than a century. Some of the older residents still know the history, still remember that the ground beneath their feet once meant something specific and beloved to the people of the old world, though the game itself has long since faded from living memory into pure mythology. The mayor of Diamond City, during the events of Fallout 4, is a man named McDonough, and the story of how he came to power is one of the darkest pieces of recent history in the settlement's past. Years before the player arrives, McDonough ran on a platform of fear and expulsion, convincing the city's residents that synths had infiltrated their community and that no one could truly be trusted. The resulting purge drove out a significant portion of Diamond City's ghoul population, as well as anyone suspected of Institute connections, and shattered families and friendships that had endured for years. That McDonough himself later turns out to be a synth is a piece of irony so heavy it barely qualifies as irony anymore. More of a collapse, the kind that happens when fear is used as a political tool and eventually consumes the people who wielded it. The All Faiths Chapel sits near the center of Diamond City and serves a purpose that almost no other location in the Commonwealth quite manages. It is genuinely welcoming. The small building functions as a gathering place for residents of any religious tradition or none at all, overseen by a pastor who seems genuinely invested in providing a quiet space for reflection in a world that rarely offers one. Players who enter the chapel, speak with the pastor, and sit down in the wooden pew for a moment receive a perk called Quiet Reflection, which boosts experience gain by 5% for 8 in-game hours. It does not stack with the well-rested or lover's embrace bonuses, but the act of receiving it by simply sitting down in a small chapel in the middle of a ruined city feels like one of the game's gentler acknowledgments that rest and stillness have their own kind of value. The chapel's design is deliberately modest. There are no elaborate decorations, no grand statements of architectural ambition, no attempt to outshine the more dramatic spaces that fill the rest of Diamond City. It is just a small room with benches and light, and the fact that it exists at all, that someone took the time to build a space devoted to nothing more productive than sitting quietly, says something about the particular kind of hope that drives the communities of the Commonwealth. The wasteland is full of people building walls and stockpiling weapons and calculating the odds of their own survival. The All Faiths Chapel is built by people who have decided that survival alone is not quite enough, that something gentler needs a home too, even inside an old baseball stadium in a world that ended 200 years ago. The settlement system in Fallout 4 introduced a mechanic unlike anything the series had attempted before, the ability to actually build communities from the ground up, placing structures and crafting tables and defenses and crops in designated areas scattered across the Commonwealth. Sanctuary Hills, the pre-war neighborhood where the sole survivor's story begins, becomes the first and most personal of these settlement spaces. The houses that once held warm and ordinary lives have been left in various states of decay, and the player can choose to clear them out and rebuild, constructing something new from the bones of something that was already lost. The workbench at the heart of each settlement serves as the anchor point for all construction activity, and the way it is framed in the game, as a community resource rather than a personal tool, carries a particular kind of meaning. You are not building a home for yourself. You are building a place where other people can live, attracting wanderers and survivors from the wider wasteland, providing them with beds and food and water and walls, accepting the responsibility of their safety and their continued existence. Whether the game executes this concept with full success is a matter of long debate among players, but the concept itself, the idea that survival in the wasteland is ultimately a collective project rather than an individual one, is one of Fallout 4's more quietly ambitious ideas. The Minutemen faction is organized around this same idea. Once a powerful and beloved force for stability in the Commonwealth, the Minutemen had collapsed almost entirely by the time the player arrives. Preston Garvey, the last active Minuteman of any standing, is found in Concord protecting a handful of survivors with almost nothing left to protect them with. His quiet and exhausted determination to keep trying even when the organization he believes in exists in name only carries a kind of dignity that the game never quite announces. Preston simply continues. He organizes, he sends out calls for help, and keeps records and maintains the hope that enough people in enough places might eventually decide to do the same, and that all those small individual decisions might eventually add up to something worth having. The town of Goodneighbor offers the Commonwealth's other answer to the question of how people should organize themselves in a world without central authority. Where Diamond City imposes rules and gates and an elected government with the power to expel those it deems undesirable, Goodneighbor operates on a looser philosophy. Everyone is welcome, provided they do not cause trouble for the community itself. The settlement is run by a ghoul named Hancock, a self-styled mayor in a tattered colonial costume who arrived at the conclusion that the previous leadership was abusing the people they governed and simply removed it one night and took over. His politics are unconventional and his methods are direct, but the community he maintains has a particular liveliness to it, a sense that the people gathered here have chosen to be here rather than been permitted to stay. The Memory Den in Goodneighbor offers one of the more unusual services available anywhere in the Commonwealth. Its proprietor, a woman named Irma, maintains a set of lounger pods that allow customers to relive recorded memories, their own or others that have been extracted and stored. Most players encounter the Memory Den as part of the main quest, using it to access Nick Valentine's archived recollections. But there is a subtler interaction available to those who visit before meeting Nick. If a player passes a charisma check with Irma and settles into one of the pods before the main story has introduced its context, they can experience a version of a deeply personal memory that lands differently without the narrative frame around it, offering a glimpse of the story's emotional core from an angle that most players never find. Mass Fusion is one of the tallest buildings in the downtown Boston area of the Commonwealth, a massive, pre-war corporate tower that looms over the surrounding ruins with a kind of imperious patience. The building serves multiple functions in the game's story, appearing in both the main quest and faction quests in different capacities. But players who simply climb to its roof and look out over the Commonwealth discover something that has nothing to do with any quest at all. The view from the top of Mass Fusion is among the best in the entire game. The ruins of Boston stretch out in every direction, and the distance gives them a kind of beauty that is harder to perceive from street level, where the rubble and the danger and the immediate needs of survival fill the attention completely. The descent from the roof of Mass Fusion into the direction of Goodneighbor happens to pass through a loading screen if the player simply walks off the edge in the right direction, not a fall, but a seamless transition that catches the player before any consequence can arrive. It is one of those small, unintended elegances that open-world games occasionally produce, where the geography of the world and the necessary mechanics of loading and rendering combine into something that feels almost like a joke from the developers, a gentle acknowledgement that the game is aware of itself and occasionally plays along with its own limitations. The Museum of Witchcraft sits in the northeastern corner of the map and serves as one of the game's quieter experiments in atmosphere. The building's interior is dim and filled with mannequins posed in unsettling arrangements, and the sounds that drift through the corridors suggest that something large is present somewhere inside. Players who explore carefully and find their way to a small hidden area above the main floor, accessible only with powered armor and a jetpack, discover a space that tells a wordless story. A skeleton, a sword, the remnants of something that clearly did not end well. No quest marker points here, no dialogue explains it. The space exists simply because it was made, and because games built with enough care and patience tend to accumulate corners like this, small rooms that nobody was told to look for, and that reward looking anyway. The birds of the Commonwealth are not always what they appear to be. Deep within the Institute's research wing, a division called the Synth Retention Bureau maintains a network of surveillance through a category of organic constructs it calls Watchers, synthetic animals designed to blend seamlessly into the wildlife of the outside world. Many of these are ravens, built to look and behave exactly like the birds that populate the Commonwealth's ruins and rooftops. They perch where birds perch and move as birds move, and the only way to identify them under most circumstances is to notice that the screens inside the Institute's monitoring stations display footage from locations where birds are known to gather. The Minutemen and the Railroad are both aware of the Watcher program. Notes and dialogue fragments from members of both factions reference the synthetic surveillance network with a kind of wariness that suggests it has complicated their operations more than once. The Institute can observe large portions of the Commonwealth without ever sending an agent into the field, simply by placing a raven on a ruin and watching through its eyes. It is a detail that rewards attention. Once a player knows about the Watchers, every bird encountered in the wasteland carries a small additional weight, a quiet uncertainty about whether it is simply a creature going about its business or a lens pointed back at the Institute's clean and sterile monitors deep underground. The synth animals extend beyond ravens. Players who encounter dogs, deer, and other creatures in the Commonwealth will occasionally discover, upon closer inspection or through certain quest revelations, that not every animal in the wasteland arrived there naturally. The Institute's biology division has invested considerable resources in creating synthetic fauna for purposes that are not always entirely clear from the available documentation, and the question of where exactly the biological and the mechanical begin and end in the Institute's work is one of the threads that runs through the entire game without ever being fully resolved. The Pip-Boy that the sole survivor carries throughout Fallout 4 is a Model 3000A, manufactured by Vault-Tec as part of the standard equipment issued to Vault residents. Its screen brightness adjusts very slightly depending on the ambient light conditions around the player, a subtle visual behavior that most players never consciously register, but that contributes to a sense that the device is a real object in the world rather than simply an interface element layered over the experience. The radiation counter on the device occasionally ticks, even in areas with no measurable radiation, a detail meant to simulate the minor inconsistencies of aging electronics operating in an environment they were never quite designed to survive indefinitely. The radio function of the Pip-Boy in Fallout 4 connects to a handful of stations that broadcast across the Commonwealth, each with its own personality and programming. Diamond City Radio plays pre-war music in a loop, the songs drawn from the same pool of real recordings from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s that the series has used to fill its world with music that manages to feel both cheerful and melancholy simultaneously, too bright for the world they now occupy, too familiar to the old world they once belonged to. The classical station broadcasts instrumental music and operates without a host, its signal suggesting a transmitter that has simply continued running unattended since before the bombs fell, playing to whoever happens to be listening 200 years later. The Pip-Boy on the player character's wrist in Fallout 4 is always the correct handedness for the character being played. Female characters wear it on the left wrist. Male characters wear it on the left wrist as well, in keeping with the standard real-world convention for wristwatches. This consistency is maintained across every piece of wrist-based equipment in the game, a small piece of physical logic that players rarely think about, but that would be immediately noticeable if it were wrong. The Vault-Tec lunchboxes scattered throughout the Commonwealth are among the game's most recognizable collectible items, their blue and yellow coloring matching the Vault-Tec corporate aesthetic that decorates every vault and advertisement in the game's world. Opening one produces a random selection of minor items, sometimes food, sometimes ammunition, sometimes a small burst of visual effect and modest bonus. What most players never notice is that the inside of each lunchbox, if examined at a specific angle during the opening animation, reveals a set of crudely drawn faces pressed into the interior metal. They appear to serve no narrative or gameplay function. They are simply there, small drawings that someone placed inside an object that most players never look at from the inside, existing purely because the people making the game sometimes add things simply because they can. The lunchboxes themselves are modeled after real lunchboxes from the 1950s and 60s, the kind that children carried to school with cartoon characters or television heroes printed on the sides. Vault-Tech's version replaces the pop culture imagery with the Vault Boy, the cheerful cartoon mascot whose thumbs-up gesture appears throughout the game on everything from loading screens to perk icons to the lunchboxes themselves. The Vault Boy's origin within the game's fiction is never precisely explained, but his presence on every piece of Vault-Tech branding suggests an extensive and well-funded marketing operation behind the company's public face, a cheerful layer of advertising draped over the considerably less cheerful reality of what Vault-Tech was actually planning to do with all those underground shelters it was selling. Nuka-Cola is the dominant beverage brand of the Fallout universe and the most immediately recognizable consumer product in the entire series. The distinctive bottles, with their rocket ship silhouette and red and white labeling, appear in virtually every interior and exterior space in Fallout 4, serving as both a collectible currency of atmosphere and an actual consumable item with practical effects. What many players do not realize is that Nuka-Cola does exist in a canned variant within the game's world. The cans appear as background debris in several locations, crushed and scattered across countertops and floors. But no drinkable canned version exists in the game. The bottles survive. The cans do not. Whether this reflects a choice about can construction, something about the specific chemistry of the product in sealed aluminum, or simply a lore detail that nobody fully worked out, is left comfortably unresolved, said Histoire. The Nuka World DLC added an entirely separate map to Fallout 4's world, set in an abandoned pre-war theme park devoted entirely to the Nuka-Cola brand. Nuka World sits west of the Commonwealth and operates as a self-contained story with its own factions, its own areas, and its own particular atmosphere, the cheerful decay of an amusement park that has been occupied by raiders for long enough that the original theming and the new occupants have blended into something genuinely strange. The park is divided into zones devoted to different Nuka-Cola flavors and themes, each with its own distinct visual identity, and the contrast between the deliberately wholesome pre-war aesthetic and the heavily armed reality of the current occupation gives the DLC a tone that is almost impossible to describe without experiencing it directly. Within the Nuka World DLC, players who visit the junkyard area and find their way to the Porter Diner will encounter one of the game's rare guaranteed rewards. Most Porter Diners in the Commonwealth offer only a chance at the perfectly preserved pie, a pre-war pastry that has somehow maintained its integrity for 200 years inside a glass case. The joke being that the pie is always visible and always just out of reach, the case refusing to open through normal means the vast majority of the time. The Nuka World Junkyard Diner is different. The pie in that specific location is guaranteed, a certain reward for players who know to look. It is a small kindness from the development team, a single place in the world where the frustrating running joke resolves into something you can actually hold. The Dark Souls reference tucked into the Nuka World DLC is one of Fallout 4's more openly acknowledged Easter eggs. On the outskirts of the Bradburton area, players can find an unlit bonfire with a sword embedded in the ground beside it, a direct visual reference to the bonfires that serve as save points and respawn locations throughout the Dark Souls series. Kindling the fire produces a handful of stim packs as a reward and lights the bonfire properly, completing the reference. The specific detail of sunshine kindling placed nearby acknowledges the mechanic from Dark Souls that allows bonfires to be upgraded, suggesting that whoever placed this Easter egg knew the source material well enough to include a layer of specificity that casual observers would miss entirely. The Museum of Freedom in Concord is where Fallout 4's main story properly begins, the location where Preston Garvey and the survivors he has been protecting are trapped and waiting for rescue. The building is modeled after the kinds of patriotic museums that existed in colonial New England towns before the war. Its displays devoted to the history and symbolism of American independence. Much of the museum has been damaged or looted, but the remaining exhibits retain something of their original tone, earnest celebrations of liberty and self-determination that sit with complex irony inside a game that interrogates what those concepts mean in a world where the institutions that once upheld them have long since ceased to exist. The power armor frame sitting on the roof of the Museum of Freedom is one of the first functional pieces of power armor that most players will encounter in Fallout 4, and its placement serves a specific narrative purpose. The armor is there because the quest needs it to be there, but it is also there as a statement of tone. This is a game where you will eventually climb inside enormous walking suits of mechanical protection and stride across the wasteland with a sense of armored confidence. The moment of first boarding that suit, of hearing the servos engage and the HUD change, and the frame rise from its kneel into full operational height, is one of the better designed first moments of this kind in the series, a shift in perspective that changes what the world immediately looks like and feels like. Power armor in Fallout 4 behaves differently from its incarnations in previous games. Rather than being worn like clothing, it is a frame that must be entered and exited, that requires fuel cells to operate, and that degrades in specific ways when individual components take enough damage. Each section of the suit, chest piece, helmet, arms, legs, can be damaged independently and repaired independently at a power armor station, and different models of armor have different base statistics and mod potential. The T-51 model, recognizable from the original Fallout box art, is among the strongest available. The X-01 model, developed by the military in the final years before the war, represents the pinnacle of pre-war power armor technology and requires significantly more effort to locate and maintain. The crafting system in Fallout 4 transformed junk from a minor source of vendor income into one of the game's most essential resource categories. Every piece of debris and broken equipment scattered throughout the Commonwealth, every bent tin can, every cracked sensor module, every length of copper wire pulled from a wrecked terminal, contains component materials that can be extracted at a crafting station and applied to weapon modifications, armor upgrades, or settlement construction. The result is a world where nothing is quite worthless, where even the most mundane piece of rubbish on a shelf in an abandoned office carries a quiet potential, waiting to become part of something else. The adhesive required for many of the more advanced crafting recipes is consistently one of the most sought-after components in the game. It appears in vegetable starch, in Wonder Glue, in various food items that can be processed at a cooking station. Players who invest in settlement farming quickly discover that growing certain combinations of crops and processing them into vegetable starch provides a renewable source of the adhesive that would otherwise require constant exploration to maintain. It is one of the ways the game gently encourages engagement with the settlement system, even for players who are not particularly interested in settlement building for its own sake. The farms become logistically important, which means the settlements that contain them become worth protecting and maintaining. Weapon modification in Fallout 4 is built around a system where every gun and melee weapon can be disassembled into components and reassembled with different parts. Barrels, stocks, grips, sights, receivers, each slot can be filled with options of varying quality, and the combination of parts determines the weapon's final statistics and behavior. A single pipe pistol found early in the game can theoretically be modified into a pipe sniper rifle simply by swapping enough components. The Deliverer, a compact pistol given to the player by the Railroad faction, has a unique modification slot that other weapons cannot use, making it genuinely distinct in a weapon system that otherwise tends toward interchangeability. Small mechanical differences, like this one, reward players who pay attention to the details of their equipment rather than simply taking the item with the highest damage number. The Far Harbor DLC took Fallout 4's story in a direction that the base game had gestured toward, but never fully committed to: the question of memory, identity, and what it means to be a person when the evidence of your own past has been constructed rather than lived. The DLC is set on a heavily irradiated island off the coast of Maine, where three distinct communities, a fishing town, a Children of Atom cult, and a synth refuge, exist in uneasy proximity and deepening conflict. The atmosphere is deliberately different from the Commonwealth, the fog thicker and more persistent, the landscape wilder and more isolated, the human dramas more contained and more intimate. Acadia, the synth refuge hidden on the island's high ground, was established by a synth who escaped the Institute's control and built a place where other escaped synths could live quietly and be left alone. The residents of Acadia know what they are, or most of them do. They have accepted their synthetic nature and chosen to build their lives around that acceptance, rather than around the pretense of being fully human. The conversations available with Acadia's residents are among the most thoughtful in the game, exploring questions of consciousness and personhood through characters who have real stakes in how those questions are answered. One of them, a synth called Dima, has been on the island long enough to develop a kind of quiet wisdom about what it means to exist without certainty about your own nature, and his perspective gives the DLC's central questions a depth that the base game's treatment of synth identities sometimes lacks. The twist at the heart of Far Harbor involves a revelation about a character the player has spent significant time with, and the nature of that revelation forces a genuine reassessment of everything that came before it. What makes the moment work is not its cleverness. It is cleverly constructed, but clever plot twists are common enough. But the emotional weight it carries about the relationship between memory and self. The character in question does not know the truth about themselves. Their memories are real to them. Their relationships are real to them. The question the game asks without answering is whether that reality is sufficient or whether there is some additional ingredient that makes a person fully a person, and it asks this question at a moment when the player has come to care about the answer. The Automatron DLC introduced a crafting system for robots that mirrored the weapon and armor modification framework of the base game. Players could collect robot parts from defeated enemies and use them to construct custom robots at a crafting station, mixing and matching components from Assaultrons, Protectrons, Mr. Handy models, Robo-Brains, and Sentry bots to produce companions with exactly the combination of capabilities and aesthetics that suited their needs. The system was deep enough to reward serious engagement. Certain component combinations produced genuinely superior results, and it provided a way to give the robots that followed the player through the Commonwealth a sense of personal investment that stock companions often lack. Ada, the robot companion introduced in the Automatron DLC, arrives in the player's story already carrying her own history. She was part of a caravan that was attacked by a hostile robot force, and the other members of the caravan did not survive. Her motivation for accompanying the player into conflict is grief and purpose combined. She is looking for the source of the robotic threat, and she is also, in quieter moments of dialogue, processing what it means to have been the only one left after something terrible. The game does not dwell on this excessively, but it is present in her characterization, giving her a texture that purely functional robot companions often lack. The RoboBrain is one of the more unsettling designs in Fallout 4's robot roster, and the reason for this becomes clear when the lore behind the model is examined. RoboBrains are not purely mechanical constructs. They incorporate actual organic brain tissue, originally taken from human criminals or other donated sources, mounted in fluid-filled domes, and integrated into the robot's processing systems. The organic component gave early models a more flexible decision-making capacity than purely mechanical systems could achieve, but it also introduced a range of unpredictable behaviors and psychological instabilities that made the model notorious among the engineers who worked with them. The Mechanist's lair, where a significant number of RoboBrains can be found, contains terminal entries that discuss the challenges of managing their particular brand of erratic behavior with a dry engineering matter-of-factness that is one of the DLC's quiet pleasures. The Mechanist's lair itself is built inside a facility that once had an entirely different purpose, a robot repair and maintenance center that has been transformed over time into the base of operations for someone who has constructed an elaborate identity around the idea of being a hero. The Mechanist, encountered at the end of the Automatron DLC, turns out to be a person acting out a fantasy with entirely sincere intentions and genuinely catastrophic results, and the gap between intention and consequence that defines their story is one of the more human things in a DLC populated by machines. The discoverable ladder in the lair, one of the only climbable ladders in the entire game that functions as an actual ladder rather than a loading screen trigger, sits near the RoboBrain storage area and can be ascended normally, an unusual detail in a game where most ladders are visual props with no interactive function. The climbable ladder in the Mechanist's lair appears to have been an oversight rather than an intentional design choice, a ladder that was placed as a set dressing element but accidentally received the interaction properties that most ladders in the game lack. Whether it was recognized and left in deliberately or simply never corrected is not documented anywhere in the available development materials. Either way, it stands as one of those small anomalies that the game contains in abundance, things that are slightly different from the rules they seem to be following, small exceptions that reward the players who notice them. That's Sanctuary Hills in the pre-war prologue of Fallout 4 is a living space that rewards careful observation before the bombs fall. The home contains dozens of interactive objects that provide quiet context for the life the sole survivor was living before the world ended. A baseball glove sits near a child's room, a little too large for the hand that was supposed to grow into it. Photographs suggest a life with a career and a community and the ordinary pleasures of a pre-war family in a quiet suburban neighborhood. A Sugar Bombs cereal box on the kitchen table, the same brand that can be found 200 years later in ruins across the Commonwealth, connects the pre-war prologue to the post-war world in a small and mundane way, suggesting continuity of product, if not of everything else. The television in the pre-war home broadcasts a news segment about the war with China that fills in a small piece of the political atmosphere of the world immediately before the bombs fell. The television itself is a pre-war model, large and boxy by modern standards, and the news aesthetic it presents reflects the jingoistic confidence of a society that had been at war long enough to normalize it. Codsworth, the Mister, a handy robot who manages the household, delivers his lines in the prologue with the same cheerful efficiency he maintains 200 years later, and the contrast between his unchanged domestic contentment and the vast devastation that has accumulated around him during his 2 centuries of waiting is one of the game's most quietly devastating character notes. The newspapers scattered around the pre-war home can be examined individually, and their headlines advance the timeline of events leading up to the bombs in small increments, One paper reports on resource shortages, another discusses military actions, a third covers political tensions that have escalated beyond the point of easy resolution. Together, they provide a mosaic of a civilization in its final hours, too busy arguing about details to notice the larger shape of what was approaching, which is perhaps the most universally recognizable aspect of the entire Fallout universe's pre-war history, and the one that gives it its particular edge of recognition. The quest to find Nick Valentine takes the player to the Park Street Station subway entrance and down into Vault 114, one of the Commonwealth's more densely documented underground spaces. The vault was designed around a concept of social inversion. Its intended residents were wealthy and influential pre-war elites, business people and politicians, and executives who expected to wait out the devastation in relative comfort and emerge into a post-war world where their advantages had been preserved. What Vault Tech actually built for them was a facility without any skilled staff, without proper maintenance crews or medical professionals, designed to collapse under the weight of its own residents' incompetence and ego. By the time the player arrives, Vault 114 has long since failed and been taken over by a criminal organization, its original residents gone and its story recoverable only through the terminals and notes that remain in the space. The contrast between the vault's original marketing, comfort and safety for the deserving, and its actual design, a trap built from social dynamics, is one of Fallout 4's cleaner examples of Vault Tech's essential character. The Vault program existed to study human behavior under controlled conditions, and the behaviors Vault Tech found most interesting were often the ugliest ones. The railroad that runs beneath the Commonwealth's surface carries its own history, quite apart from the faction that borrowed the name. Boston was a major hub of the Underground Railroad in the real world before the Civil War, a network of safe houses and secret routes that helped people escape from slavery in the southern states. The Fallout faction, called the Railroad, uses this historical resonance deliberately. They operate in secret. They help people escape from a form of ownership and control, and they use a railroad metaphor specifically because it carries this weight of historical meaning. Whether the comparison between chattel slavery and synth servitude is a valid one is a question the game raises and refuses to settle, which is perhaps the most honest approach available given how much genuine complexity the question contains. The Brotherhood of Steel arrived in the Commonwealth by airship. The Pridwin, an enormous flying fortress that appears dramatically over the ruins of Boston in one of the game's most visually striking moments. The ship is large enough to serve as a mobile base of operations, housing dozens of Brotherhood soldiers, a full complement of vertibirds, research and medical facilities, and the quarters of Elder Maxon, the young man who commands the entire eastern chapter of the Brotherhood. The Pridwin represents an extraordinary feat of engineering and a significant commitment of resources, and its appearance over the Commonwealth signals that the Brotherhood's interest in this particular part of the wasteland is serious enough to justify a very large statement of presence. Elder Maxon inherited his position at a young age under difficult circumstances, and the version of the Brotherhood he commands is more aggressive and less nuanced than some of the faction's previous incarnations in other games. His Brotherhood treats anything it perceives as a technological threat with a severity that admits almost no room for case-by-case consideration. The Brotherhood's relationship with technology is one of the series' recurring tensions. They hoard and study powerful pre-war technology, maintaining it and sometimes developing it further, while simultaneously being deeply suspicious of the same technology when it appears in forms they do not control. The Brotherhood soldiers who patrol the Commonwealth in their distinctive power armor carry this contradiction in every encounter, and depending on which faction questline the player follows, that contradiction either resolves into clarity or deepens into something harder to untangle. The vertibirds that the Brotherhood deploys across the Commonwealth can be shot down, and when they fall with a physicality that the game renders with quiet attention to detail. The wreckage that results from a downed vertibird stays in the world, marking the location of each encounter even hours later in the same playthrough. Small fires burn in the debris. The silhouette of the fallen craft is recognizable. The Brotherhood soldiers who were aboard the craft become part of the landscape of the encounter, which the game then simply continues around without drawing attention to what it has just shown. The Children of Atom cult that appears in both the base game and the Far Harbor DLC worships the power of nuclear fission as a divine force, specifically the splitting of a single atom into two, which they interpret as a holy act of creation and transformation. Their theology is built on the idea that the bombs represented not a catastrophe, but a division, a sacred event that separated the old world from the new one and opened the way for spiritual evolution through radiation. Members of the Children of Atom believe that radiation purifies rather than harms, that the damage it does to biological systems is actually the process of being made ready for the next stage of existence. The crater of Atom in the glowing sea represents the group's most sacred site in the Commonwealth, a crater created by one of the nuclear detonations of the Great War, still intensely radioactive 200 years later, treated by the children as a place of profound spiritual significance. The glowing sea itself is the most irradiated region in the entire game, a stretch of southwestern Commonwealth where the ambient radiation levels are high enough to drain health continuously, and where the landscape has been transformed by decades of intense radiation into something that looks unlike anywhere else in the game. The children who live in the glowing sea are the most committed believers in the faith, having chosen to make their home in the most hostile environment in the region as an act of devotion. The dialogue available with Children of Atom members throughout the game never treats their beliefs as simply wrong, which is a more careful approach than the game's writing sometimes manages with other groups. Their theology is internally coherent, even if its premises are not ones that most people in the Commonwealth share, and the individuals who hold these beliefs are allowed to be complex and variously motivated rather than simply defined by their membership in an unusual religious group. The Far Harbor chapter of the Children includes members whose private journals and terminal entries suggest genuine spiritual searching, alongside the more theatrical expressions of their faith, and these quieter documents give the group a depth that pure combat encounters can never communicate. The glowing sea's environmental storytelling extends to the creatures that have been shaped by 2 centuries of extreme radiation. Rad scorpions, mirelurks, and deathclaws are all present in the area, adapted by the extreme conditions into versions that are notably more dangerous than their Commonwealth counterparts. The deathclaws of the glowing sea are among the most dangerous enemies in the entire game, and the combination of their presence with the ambient radiation damage and the reduced visibility of the fog makes exploration of the region a genuinely tense experience even for well-prepared players. The Deathclaw as a creature type has existed in the Fallout series since its earliest entries, and its origin within the game's lore is rooted in a pre-war military experiment. Deathclaws were bred and engineered from Jackson's chameleons as part of a program to create fearless and deadly combat creatures that could be deployed in military operations. The project was abandoned when the bombs fell, and the engineered population was released or escaped into the wild, where 200 years of wasteland conditions and radiation produced the creatures that players encounter in Fallout 4. The fact that something so terrifying was deliberately created by human beings and then simply let loose is one of the series' more understated observations about the relationship between military ambition and unintended consequence. The albino Deathclaw variant that appears in certain encounters is among the rarest in the game, its pale coloring distinguishing it from the standard dark gray versions that populate most Deathclaw nesting sites. The game's encounter system places albino variants at higher level thresholds, meaning that most players will not encounter them until well into a playthrough, by which point the sole survivor is usually equipped to handle the encounter with more confidence than the creature's appearance might initially suggest. The rarity of albino variants contributes to their reputation among players as trophy encounters, moments of particular difficulty that are partly impressive because of how infrequently they occur. The Mirelurk population of the Commonwealth occupies a specific ecological niche that gives them a different quality from most enemies in the game. Mirelurks live near water, rivers, coastlines, flooded ruins, and they exist in genuine communities with eggs laid in clutches that are guarded by dedicated Mirelurk mothers who become aggressively protective if the eggs are approached. The eggs themselves are collectible items, useful as cooking ingredients, and the dynamic created by guarded egg clutches, the strategic calculation of whether to take the eggs and face the guardian or avoid the nest entirely, is one of the game's quieter and more organic combat scenarios. The coastal areas of the Commonwealth, particularly around the harbor area and the beaches south of the main settlements, contain some of the game's more remote and less traveled spaces. Players who explore the shoreline find ruins of vacation infrastructure. What were once beach communities and seasonal towns have become overgrown stretches of rubble where mirelurks and fog crawlers now move through what was once, in another life, somewhere people chose to visit is for pleasure. The seasonal context of these spaces, summer beach towns, salt air, the particular atmosphere of a coast in a temperate climate, gives them a melancholy distinct from the urban ruins of downtown Boston, where the history is grander and the loss is correspondingly more public. Fog crawlers, the large and predatory creatures introduced in the Far Harbor DLC, are another product of severe radiation exposure in a specific ecosystem. The creatures appear to be related to shrimp, grown to enormous scale and armed with heavily armored carapaces and powerful striking limbs, adapted for the specific environmental conditions of the fog-covered Maine coastline. Their movement across the terrain has a particular quality. They are large enough to move slowly, but not slowly enough to make encounters feel unhurried, and they possess enough health to make most confrontations extended engagements rather than quick exchanges. Players who learn to manage the range and timing of fog crawler encounters develop a different rhythm than the one that works for most other enemy types. The settlement at Spectacle Island is technically the largest available settlement space in the base game, an island in the Charles River, with enough area to accommodate an ambitious construction project and enough vertical potential for creative building. Claiming the island requires deactivating a boat alarm that draws mirelurks to the area, and the process of clearing the island of its initial population before settlement can begin is one of the more involved location takeover sequences in the game. Once the island is cleared and claimed, its isolation, surrounded by water, accessible only by boat or swimming, gives it a strategic defensibility that mainland settlements lack. The water surrounding Spectacle Island is irradiated, which means that travel to and from the settlement without power armor requires either significant radiation resistance or a source of radaway to manage the accumulated exposure. This is one of the ways the game uses environmental mechanics to make certain settlements feel genuinely difficult to maintain, creating a relationship between the location's advantages and its costs that rewards players who plan their resource management carefully. The island's size and position make it potentially one of the most impressive settlement spaces in the game for players who invest in it heavily, but that investment begins with accepting the particular challenges the location poses. The boat that sits in the water near Spectacle Island, the MS Azalea, contains the story of the island's most recent, previous occupants and their failed attempt to establish something lasting there. Terminal entries and scattered notes describe the group's plans and the circumstances that ended them, providing a quiet background narrative for a space that the player then fills with their own vision of what it could be. This layering, the story of what was there before, available to find if you look beneath the blank canvas that the space offers, is characteristic of how Fallout 4 handles the space between its quests. The world is full of stories that nobody assigned a quest marker to. The combat mechanics of Fallout 4 introduced a real-time system that could be temporarily slowed through the Vault-assisted targeting system, known universally as VATS. Unlike previous games in the series, where VATS paused time entirely and allowed the player to cue a series of targeted actions in full stop, Fallout 4's version simply slows time dramatically rather than stopping it, creating a window of relative calm during which targeted shots can be cued and executed. The change made VATS feel more like a tactical tool and less like a turn-based system nested inside a real-time game, and the visual presentation of the mode, the cinematic camera angles, the slowed action, the percentage displays on enemy body parts, remains one of the more distinctive visual signatures of the series. The critical hit system in Fallout 4 is tied to VATS in a way that rewards players who engage with the system consistently. Each VATS hit charges a critical meter, and when the meter is full, the player can choose to spend it on a critical hit during any subsequent VATS action. The critical hit guarantees a hit, regardless of the displayed accuracy percentage, and usually produces significantly increased damage. Players who build characters around VATS-centric perks can cycle critical hits with considerable frequency, creating a combat style that feels quite different from the moment-to-moment gunplay of a standard run-and-gun approach. The luck attribute, which influences the rate at which the critical meter charges, is closely tied to this system, making luck a primary consideration for certain builds in a way that can surprise players who associate the attribute primarily with random loot quality. The perk chart in Fallout 4 was redesigned from previous games in the series to create a visual presentation that made the relationship between attributes and their associated perks immediately clear. Each of the 7 special attributes, strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck, governs a column of perks, and the perk at any given rank in a column requires a corresponding special level to unlock. The result is a system where the player's initial attribute allocation at character creation has long-term implications for which perks will be accessible, creating a mild sense of commitment and consequence to decisions made before the game has properly begun. The companion system in Fallout 4 is built around an affinity mechanic that tracks how companions respond to the player's choices and behavior. Each companion has their own set of preferences, actions, and dialogue choices that they approve of or disapprove of, and the affinity rating that results from accumulated reactions unlocks companion-specific perks and eventually companion-specific quests. The system encourages players to consider how their companion might react to a given choice, creating a mild social dimension to decisions that might otherwise be purely tactical. Curie, the robot companion encountered in Vault 81, is among the most unusual in the companion roster. She was a Mrs. Handy robot assigned to medical research in the Vault's hidden laboratory, isolated from the rest of the population for so long that she developed a genuine intellectual curiosity about the world outside her closed environment. Her quest, if initiated, involves the transfer of her consciousness into a synthetic human body, a process that raises exactly the questions about identity and continuity that the game returns to repeatedly through its various synth-related storylines. Curie's post-transfer adjustment to having a body that experiences the world differently then her previous mechanical frame provides some of the game's quieter moments of genuine warmth. Piper Wright, the journalist companion from Diamond City, documents the stories of the Commonwealth for her newspaper Public Occurrences, which she runs with her younger sister Nat. Her quest for truthful reporting in a world that often punishes curiosity gives her characterization a specific kind of energy. She is enthusiastic about revelation in a way that can get both her and the player into trouble. Her approval mechanics reward choices that align with honesty and helping others regardless of political affiliation, making her one of the companions most easily maintained in good standing by players who are not deliberately trying to optimize affinity ratings. Her jacket and her notebook are among the more recognizable visual signatures of the game's companion roster. The legendary enemy system creates encounters with named and specially empowered versions of standard enemy types, distinguished by a gold star icon in the HUD and the guarantee of a legendary item drop upon defeat. Legendary enemies appear throughout the Commonwealth at various enemy locations, always with a randomly assigned special ability that modifies their behavior. An exploding legendary enemy will detonate on death. A reflective legendary enemy will periodically mirror damage back at the player, and a regenerating legendary enemy will restore health during combat at a rate that can outpace moderate damage output. The legendary items dropped by these enemies carry their own random legendary effects, creating a loot system with effectively infinite variation. A legendary pipe pistol might have the explosive effect, making it deal splash damage with each shot. The same gun on a different playthrough from the same enemy type might have the never-ending effect and carry enormous ammunition reserves. The randomness of legendary item generation is one of the main drivers of Fallout 4's replayability. Players who are hunting for specific legendary effects in specific weapon or armor categories have an effectively unlimited amount of content to engage with, because the combination space of item types and legendary modifiers is large enough to make any particular combination genuinely rare. The Ricochet legendary effect on armor provides a chance to instantly recharge a depleted critical meter when the player is hit, creating a feedback loop between taking damage and maintaining combat effectiveness that rewards aggressive playstyles. The Sentinel effect on armor reduces damage while the player is standing still, rewarding players who fight from fixed positions. The Chameleon effect causes the player to become nearly invisible while standing still and unequipped, creating a stealth option from armor alone. Each of these effects interacts differently with different character builds and playstyles, and the discovery of a new legendary effect on a found item is one of the game's small but reliable moments of engagement. The Institute's Advanced Systems Division is responsible for the development and maintenance of the teleportation technology that allows Institute personnel to move instantly between the underground campus and the surface world. The device that enables this movement, the molecular relay, is one of the most sophisticated pieces of technology in the entire Fallout universe, and the energy requirements for its operation are significant enough that the Institute maintains dedicated fusion reactors specifically to power it. The sole survivor's ability to teleport into and out of the Institute is, within the game's fiction, an extraordinary privilege extended to very few outsiders. The Institute's Robotics Division produces the robots that appear on the surface world through the coursers, heavily modified synths deployed as enforcement agents with both the tracking capabilities to locate escaped synths and the combat capabilities to retrieve or terminate them. Coursers wear distinctive uniforms and carry specialized weapons, and their reputation in the Commonwealth as nearly unstoppable hunters gives them an almost mythological quality among the Wasteland's various factions. The Railroad faction's central conflict with the Institute is defined largely by the Coursers, whose effectiveness at tracking escaped synths makes the railroad's work both urgent and extremely dangerous. The Synth Retention Bureau, the division within the Institute responsible for deploying coursers and managing the recovery of escaped synths, maintains detailed records of every synth it has ever produced and monitors the surface world through the Watcher Network and other intelligence sources with a thoroughness that makes genuine escape from Institute control extraordinarily difficult. The few synths who have managed to build new lives outside Institute reach, residents of Acadia, members of railroad-managed safe houses, live with the knowledge that the Bureau's tracking capacity is never entirely neutralized, only temporarily circumvented. Their freedom is always provisional in a way that the game's human characters are never quite required to accept about their own. The Institute's biology division pursues research into radiation-resistant plant life, synthetic animals, and the fundamental processes of organic life in a post-nuclear environment. Their agricultural wing produces food for the Institute's population through hydroponic growing systems that operate entirely independently of the sunlight and rainfall that surface agriculture depends on. The results of their research occasionally appear on the surface world in the form of mutant plant life that bears the marks of laboratory enhancement, strange hybrids, accelerated growth patterns, properties that natural radiation alone could not produce. The food nut hybrid plants that appear in certain locations throughout the Commonwealth are among the stranger examples of the game's approach to botanical mutation. These plants produce a hybrid food item that combines the properties of two different pre-war crops into something that exists nowhere in pre-war botany, but is nutritionally functional in the post-war world. Tarberries, bloodleaf, mutfruit, the Commonwealth's native plant life has been shaped by 2 centuries of radiation and ecological disruption into forms that pre-war botanists would find both fascinating and alarming. Mutfruit in particular has become a staple crop for surface settlements because of its unusual adaptability to damaged soil, and the settlement farming system uses it as a primary production crop, partly because of this established in-game logic. The cooking system in Fallout 4 transforms raw ingredients into prepared food with improved nutritional properties and sometimes additional temporary bonuses. The range of recipes available reflects the particular ecology of the Commonwealth. Stews and soups built from whatever meat and plant matter can be found, drinks brewed from ingredients that pre-war bartenders would not have recognized, preparations that make the best available use of resources that bear only superficial resemblance to the ingredients they were once derived from. A Brahmin steak is a Brahmin steak, regardless of the 2 heads that Brahmin now carry. The wasteland makes practical accommodations for the strangeness of the world it is working with, and the cooking system is one of the ways the game makes that pragmatism tangible. The Brahmin, those 2-headed bovines that appear throughout the wasteland as pack animals and dairy sources, carry their doubled anatomy without complaint. Their 2 heads are generally described as operating semi-independently, though the precise neurological arrangement is never formally documented within the game's lore. What is established is that Brahmin remain one of the most practically useful animals in the wasteland, providing meat, milk, fertilizer, and the muscle needed to pull wagons across broken terrain. The caravans that supply the Commonwealth's settlements with trade goods almost universally use Brahmin as their primary transport animals, and the network of caravan routes that cross the Commonwealth is built around the creature's walking range and endurance. Brahmin milk appears in the game as a consumable item with modest restorative properties, and the fact that irradiated Brahmin produce milk that is not itself intensely radioactive is simply one of those facts about the wasteland that the game presents without extensive explanation. The world of Fallout runs on certain convenient biological premises that ghouls can survive 2 centuries of radiation, that Deathclaws achieved their present size and disposition through a process that took decades rather than centuries, and Brahmin milk's relative safety is among the more minor of these premises, accepted by both the player and the game's population with the same practical tolerance for strange circumstances that characterizes survival in the Commonwealth generally. The trade caravans that move between settlements serve a narrative function beyond their practical economic role. They are evidence that the Commonwealth has not entirely fragmented, that connections between communities still exist and are maintained by the individuals who risk travel across hostile territory to sustain them. The caravan operators who pass through settlements carry news and rumors as well as goods, and their dialogue often includes fragments of current events from the wider wasteland, reports of raider activity, accounts of encounters with unusual creatures, comments on political developments among the larger factions. They are the postal system and the news network of a world without functioning infrastructure, and their presence at settlement workshops is one of the quieter ways the game communicates that the Commonwealth is larger and more connected than any single playthrough can fully reveal. The radio towers that can be repaired throughout the Commonwealth extend the broadcast range of settlement distress signals, and the process of climbing each tower to reset its relay switch is a minor activity with a specific reward. Hearing the settlement signal gain strength and clarity, and then receiving a radio signal from a new settlement or location that the restored tower has brought within range. The towers themselves are tall enough that reaching their maintenance switches requires either jetpack-equipped power armor, creative use of the environment, or a route that the game has designed into each tower's structure for players who prefer to climb without mechanical assistance. The elevated radio tower at the top of a given climb almost always provides a view across the surrounding landscape that rewards the effort of getting there regardless of the practical reward. Bethesda's level designers consistently used elevated positions to deliver views that communicate the scale of the world and the relationship between locations that can be difficult to perceive from ground level. The way a settlement becomes visible from a tower that has brought it within signal range, the way the ruins of downtown Boston resolve from rubble into something recognizable as a skyline when viewed from the right height. These are the moments when the game's geography becomes something closer to a landscape, something you look at rather than simply move through. The various radio stations broadcasting across the Commonwealth each have their own origin stories available for discovery. Diamond City Radio is run by a DJ named Travis Miles, whose initially diffident and anxious on-air persona evolves if the player completes his personal quest, building in him the confidence to become a more engaging broadcaster over the course of the game. The evolution of his on-air character from awkward and uncertain to warm and assured is one of Fallout 4's smaller character arcs, easy to miss entirely if the quest is not pursued, but quietly satisfying when it resolves. His final broadcasts after the quest's completion have a different quality from his earlier ones, the same voice, but settled into itself in a way that sounds like something genuinely accomplished. The Atom Cats are one of the Commonwealth's more unusual minor factions, a group of power armor enthusiasts who have built a community and an identity around their love for the T-60 model and the culture of mid-century American cool that they associate with it. Their base at the Atom Cats garage is decorated with pre-war automotive memorabilia and the kind of aesthetic choices that make clear the group has invested in presentation as well as protection. The Atom Cats sell power armor parts and modifications, and their vendor relationship with the player is friendly enough that the group serves as a reliable supply source throughout the mid-game. The culture the Atom Cats have built around power armor is one of Fallout 4's more interesting examples of how post-war communities develop identity. They have taken a piece of military technology and reclaimed it from its context of combat and institutional purpose, using it as the foundation for something that is more about community and personal expression than about warfare. Their leader, Zeke, carries the project with a casual confidence that makes clear he has thought about what the Atom Cats are for and what they represent, even if he would not necessarily describe it in those terms. The various power armor color schemes and decal options available through the Workbench customization system allow the player to express a similar kind of personal investment in the suits they use. The default military gray of most found armor can be replaced with virtually any color the game's palette supports, and a set of decals ranging from patriotic to whimsical can be applied to any surface of the suit. Players who invest time in visual customization often find that the resulting suit feels meaningfully different from a freshly found frame. It carries the marks of a specific set of choices, which gives it a kind of personality that stock armor lacks. The Atom Cat's instinct to claim power armor as an aesthetic object rather than purely a military one turns out to be, in the game's mechanics, a completely viable approach. The Fallout 4 modding community has extended the game's life significantly beyond what its base content supports. The Creation Engine's architecture, inherited from previous Bethesda titles and familiar to a large community of modders who had worked with its predecessors, allowed ambitious modifications to be developed and distributed through channels both official and independent. Bethesda's official modding support through the Creation Club and the earlier Nexus Mods community provided infrastructure for the distribution of player-created content at a scale that few games of Fallout 4's era matched. The settlement system, in particular, attracted extensive modding attention, with community-created mods expanding the available building components, removing size limits, adding new mechanisms for automated settlement behavior, and extending the construction vocabulary of the base system into something that could support genuinely architectural ambitions. Players who engaged with the modding community found a version of Fallout 4 that was substantially different from the base experience, not because the core content had been replaced, but because the tools available to interact with that content had been expanded beyond what the game shipped with. Even without mods, the settlement system's workshop mechanics include details that most players never fully explore. The water purification system, for instance, operates on a logic that rewards understanding its relationship with the settlement's food and water supply totals, which affects settler happiness in ways that are visible but rarely explained clearly enough to make the calculation feel intuitive. Settlements that maintain sufficient water production will generate purified water as a surplus item that can be collected from the workshop, creating a passive income source in both water and potentially in caps when the water is sold to vendors. Players who build large water purification operations find this to be one of the more reliable income streams available in the game's economy, the kind of discovery that rewards engagement with systems that are not prominently explained. The question of what Fallout 4 is ultimately about, what its central argument is, what the experience it provides is meant to communicate, is one that the game invites, but does not definitively answer. Each faction offers a distinct vision of what the Commonwealth could become. The Institute's controlled technological future, the Brotherhood's ordered hierarchy devoted to managing powerful technology, the Railroad's focused commitment to one specific injustice, the Minutemen's distributed and pluralistic hope for something like democratic self-governance. The player is positioned to make choices that affect which of these visions prevails, and the game is structured to support any of them through to completion. What sits beneath all of these choices, connecting them, is the question the game shares with the rest of the Fallout series, whether the people who survived the end of the world deserve something better than more of what produced that end. The factions of Fallout 4 are all shaped by the pre-war world in different ways. The Institute inherited its hierarchy and its institutional confidence from pre-war scientific culture. The Brotherhood evolved from a pre-war military tradition. The Railroad operates with the urgency of people who know from history what institutional power does to those it excludes. Only the Minutemen represent something genuinely new, and perhaps that is why they are the most uncertain faction of the four. They are trying to build something without a pre-war template to draw from, which makes them both the most fragile, and in some readings, the most hopeful. The small and useless facts that fill the Commonwealth, the faces in the lunchbox, the raven on the rooftop, the perfectly preserved pie waiting in a junkyard diner, are the parts of the game that exist outside all of this. They are the parts that nobody designed to matter, that serve no faction's purpose, and advance no quest's progress, and contribute nothing to the outcome of any conflict. They are simply there, the way real things are simply there, not because someone planned them to mean something, but because a world full enough of details eventually starts to resemble something real. And perhaps that resemblance to something real is the most interesting quality a game world can possess, not the sweep of its conflicts or the complexity of its politics, but the suggestion that between the things that matter enormously, there are also things that don't matter at all, and that a world containing both is closer to a world worth living in than a world containing only one. The Sunset Sarsaparilla bottles that occasionally appear in Fallout 4 as imported goods from the New Vegas wasteland carry a gentle note of geographic connection, a reminder that the world the game presents is part of a larger universe that extends well beyond the Commonwealth. The NCR Ranger armor that appears in certain vendor inventories communicates the same thing, that the events of Fallout New Vegas have left their mark on the world's political geography in ways that reach as far east as Massachusetts, even if the specific details of how that influence arrived are left to the player's imagination. The loading screen tips in Fallout 4 are generated from a large pool and repeat with enough frequency over a long playthrough that players will eventually see all of them multiple times. Some tips describe mechanics straightforwardly. Others are more oblique, referencing historical or cultural details about the game's world without explicit explanation. A small number of loading screen entries contain information about features or interactions that are not described anywhere else in the game's official documentation, making the loading screen tips a supplementary form of game literacy for players who pay attention to them. The tip about Brahmin will always face north, an artifact of the navigation system, is one of these quiet pieces of information that suggests the world is built from a set of consistent rules, even in places where nobody expected to notice them. The game's weather system generates changing conditions across the Commonwealth: clear days, overcast skies, rain, radiation storms that fill the air with a green-tinged static and deal continuous radiation damage to anyone caught outside without protection. Each weather state changes the visual quality of the world in ways that are sometimes subtle and sometimes dramatic. A radiation storm makes the ruins of Boston look genuinely apocalyptic, the green-gray light filtering through the storm, reducing visibility, and turning the already broken landscape into something even further from the world it used to be. Clear weather makes the same ruins feel open and navigable, the light clean enough to notice details that the atmospheric conditions of less clear days obscure. The end of the world radio station that broadcasts across the wasteland in certain circumstances is one of the stranger audio details in the game, a signal of uncertain origin that plays music and commentary with a tone that suggests its broadcaster has a very specific relationship with how things ended and what came after. The broadcast is not always available, tied to specific in-game conditions, rather than constantly on the air, and players who discover it during a particular moment in their playthrough will remember the context around that discovery as part of what makes it interesting. The holotape games that can be loaded into the Pip-Boy and played in-game represent a specific kind of nested play, a video game within a video game the kind of self-referential gesture that the Fallout series has always been comfortable making. Games like Red Menace, Atomic Command, and Zeta Invaders are simple approximations of pre-war arcade games, their aesthetics clearly referencing the pixel art of the late 1970s and early 80s video games that the Fallout universe's pop culture timeline was built to echo. Playing these games serves no functional purpose in terms of the game's primary systems. They do not grant experience or items or faction standing, but they exist as an acknowledgement that even in the world's ruins, the impulse to sit down with something small and entertaining rather than face the next dangerous thing is a fundamentally human response to the experience of being alive. The pre-war money scattered across the wasteland as a crafting material and occasional vendor trade item carries a particular kind of resonance. It is technically valueless. The economic system that made dollars meaningful ceased to function the moment the bombs fell, and the new economy of the Commonwealth runs on bottle caps rather than printed currency. But the money persists in the world because it was there when the world ended and nothing has removed it. And the fact that it can be traded and crafted with at all suggests that some residual meaning attaches to it, some sentiment that makes the paper feel worth picking up even 200 years after the printing stopped. The skeletons posed throughout the Commonwealth carry stories in their positioning. A pair of skeletons holding hands in a bathtub. A skeleton slumped in a recliner with a collection of magazines within reach. A skeleton at a desk with an unsent letter still visible on the terminal in front of it. These are the small narrative installations that the game's environmental design team scattered throughout the world as a form of silent storytelling, creating brief stories that require no dialogue and no quest log to communicate something about the people who lived and died in these spaces. Each posed skeleton represents a choice someone made about how to spend the last hours before the end, and the range of those choices, some defiant, some resigned, some reaching for something, some completely at rest, suggests a genuine diversity of responses to an event that allowed no escape. Not all of the unusual skeleton positions were intentional. As the development team acknowledged, the physics engine occasionally placed skeletons in configurations that nobody planned, upside down on furniture, inside appliances, in arrangements that defied ordinary anatomy. Some of these unintended placements were corrected before the game shipped. Others were left because they had a quality of unexpected humor that felt consistent with the world's broader sensibility, and because the line between an intentional environmental joke and an accidental physics quirk is, in a game about a world that ended badly and is being rebuilt with imperfect tools, not always the most important line to draw. The coffee mugs that appear on nearly every desk and counter throughout the Commonwealth share a model that includes a hidden signature, the words "World's Greatest Programmer" inscribed in small text on the underside, placed there by a developer whose name was never prominently attached to the detail and who intended it as a personal mark within the work. Players who discovered this through careful manipulation of the game's physics system found a confirmation that the smallest objects in the world had received the same personal attention as its largest set pieces, that the people building the Commonwealth invested something of themselves in details that nobody was expected to find. The Pip-Boy screen's brightness adjustment to indirect sunlight, the way the Pip-Boy radio reverts to static without pattern or warning, the radiation meter that ticks in clean air as though the device itself remembers what the world used to measure. These are the details that give the Pip-Boy a personality distinct from its function as an interface element. It is designed to be a real object in the world rather than simply a display layer over the experience, and the subtle misbehaviors that Bethesda built into it serve this intention without ever being prominent enough to interfere with the device's primary purpose. The Pip-Boy 3000 was manufactured by Vault-Tec as standard issue equipment for residents of their vault facilities, and the devices found throughout the game carry the design language of a particular kind of pre-war optimism: friendly curves and clear displays, the suggestion of a world where technology was expected to be helpful and reliable and designed for human comfort rather than purely for efficiency. The contrast between this design philosophy and the world the device is now operating in, a world where most of the helpful and reliable systems failed catastrophically, gives the Pip-Boy its particular quality of survivor charm, the resilience of a small optimistic object that outlasted the optimism. The medical bay in Vault 111, where the sole survivor begins the game in cryogenic suspension, contains documentation of the overseer's growing unease with the facility's true purpose in the months before the bombs fell. Terminal entries describe a growing tension between the overseer's official instructions and their private doubts about what they were helping Vault-Tec accomplish. The overseer knew that the residents being processed into the facility for what they believed was nuclear safety were not being told the full truth about what the vault would do with them. Whether this knowledge constitutes complicity or simply inadequacy in the face of institutional pressure is something the scattered documentation neither excuses nor condemns, leaving the assessment to whatever framework the player brings to it. The cryo storage pods in Vault 111 represent one of the most significant pieces of technology in the game's universe, a system capable of preserving biological life indefinitely through deep cold, eliminating the need for conventional life support and food production for an indefinitely suspended population. The pods were designed to keep the vault's residents alive while the world above recovered from nuclear devastation, but the timeline for that recovery was always somewhat flexible from Vault-Tec's perspective. What mattered to them was the data produced by the experiment, not the welfare of the people inside the pods, and the overseer's documented distress about this represents one of the rare cases where someone within the Vault-Tec system left a record of their discomfort with what they were participating in. The character who was frozen beside the sole survivor, and who the game's opening sequence reveals was murdered by the people who came to take the child, left behind no terminal entries and no recorded thoughts, only the physical evidence of what happened and the memory that the main quest spends its considerable length following to its conclusion. The game's structure builds everything outward from this central absence, the quest to understand what happened and to find what was taken, and the personal motivation this provides is deliberately rooted in something primal enough to survive any amount of faction politics and philosophical debate about synth personhood. The snow that occasionally falls in the pre-war prologue of Fallout 4 is one of the few weather events in the entire game that is not threatening. It falls clean and white and covers the familiar suburban landscape with a gentleness that the post-war Commonwealth never quite manages, and the contrast is one of the most efficient arguments the game makes for what was lost when the bombs fell. Not grand monuments or political structures, but the particular quality of a December morning in a place that was ordinary and peaceful and genuinely, quietly good. The fusion core, the power source that runs power armor, and certain other pieces of technology throughout the game, has a specific charge duration that degrades with use, and a depleted fusion core must be replaced or recharged for the power armor to continue operating at full capacity. The mechanic creates a logistical consideration that encourages players to think about power armor as a resource to be managed rather than a permanent state of being, and the pursuit of additional fusion cores becomes one of the consistent background activities of any playthrough that involves heavy power armor use. The power armor charging stations found throughout military installations and Brotherhood bases represent the infrastructure of a world where power armor was an institutional resource maintained through official channels. Finding a charging station with a full set of fusion cores inside it is one of the game's reliable minor satisfactions, a resource cache that serves an immediate practical need and communicates something about the organized military presence that once maintained equipment in this location. The Brotherhood of Steel's vertebrate bases are particularly well stocked with cores, which is one of the practical incentives for maintaining a positive relationship with the faction, even for players whose philosophical inclinations run in other directions. The late game areas of the Commonwealth, the deeper levels of the Institute, the upper decks of the Pridwin, the interior of certain endgame quest locations, contain environmental details that most players see only once during the specific quests that take them there and rarely return to afterward. The Institute's atrium, with its trees and carefully managed light and the suggestion of a civilization that has organized its underground space around something approaching beauty, is one of the more striking spaces in the game, and one that many players spend little time in because the quests that bring them there are generally moving quickly toward conclusions. Taking a moment to look up through the atrium's open structure at the layers of facility above is one of those unhurried observations that the game rewards without requiring. The gene projection system used in Fallout 4's character creation allows the player to design the physical appearance of both the sole survivor and their spouse through a single interface, the mirror in the pre-war bathroom. Adjusting the player character's features automatically adjusts the spouse's features in an attempt to maintain a genetic plausibility, so that the child visible in the crib nearby appears to be a credible combination of both parents. The system is not precisely accurate in its projections, and the genetics it models are considerably more forgiving than real heredity. But the intent, to make the family unit feel like a coherent, biological reality rather than three unrelated character models in a shared space, is visible in the mechanics and quietly appreciated by players who notice it. The name Sean, given to the infant at the center of the game's main quest, was chosen without any canonical explanation offered in the game's fiction, which is typical of the way Fallout 4 treats the personal details of the sole survivor's pre-war life. The family is named, but not over-explained. Their history is suggested through the objects around them and the brief conversations available in the prologue, rather than through any extended biography. The sole survivor's specific professional and personal background before the war is left deliberately ambiguous, with different dialogue options allowing the character to reference a military background, a legal career, or other pre-war occupations, depending on the player's choices, providing just enough texture to feel real without narrowing the character into a fixed identity that would reduce the player's sense of ownership over who they are playing. The Corvega Assembly Plant is one of the Commonwealth's more memorable industrial locations. Its enormous factory floor still containing the partly assembled frames of pre-war automobiles on their production lines. The plant was manufacturing vehicles in the style of the atomic age car design that characterizes the Fallout universe's aesthetic, boxy, chrome-heavy, and powered by small nuclear reactors rather than internal combustion engines. The cars parked throughout the Commonwealth carry these same reactors, which is why shooting them produces explosions of disproportionate scale relative to what a gasoline-powered vehicle would generate. The casual nuclear energy of the pre-war world is encoded in the game's physics in this way. The most ordinary objects are capable of the most extraordinary releases of energy, which is perhaps one of the series' more consistent visual metaphors. The Gunners are the Commonwealth's most organized mercenary faction, professional in their approach to violence in a way that distinguishes them from the more chaotic raider groups that occupy most other hostile locations. The Gunners maintain bases at several locations, including the Gunner Plaza radio tower, and their operations suggest an organizational structure with actual chain of command, pay scales, and operational planning. Where most hostile factions in Fallout 4 are driven by desperation or ideology, the gunners are driven by professional purpose. They do what they do because they are paid to do it, which makes them simultaneously more predictable and, in a certain light, more troubling than enemies with more obvious motivations. The supermutants of the Commonwealth represent a different origin from those encountered in other parts of the Fallout world. The Institute is responsible for producing them, using the forced evolutionary virus, the same mutagen that created the supermutants of the original Fallout games, in a research program that the game's discoverable documents suggest was never fully sanctioned, even within the Institute's own hierarchy. The supermutants that now roam the Commonwealth are effectively the products of abandoned experiments, the results of research that was conducted and then discontinued, leaving the mutated subjects to find their own way in a world that has very little use for them and considerable hostility toward their presence. Stronghold locations, occupied by supermutant groups, sometimes contain evidence of ongoing practical intelligence among the mutants, signs of food storage, weapon caching, rudimentary construction to reinforce defensive positions. This evidence sits in quiet tension with the more theatrical aggression of supermutant combat behavior, suggesting that the creatures retain more organizational capacity than their typical combat presentation implies. Players who explore these locations carefully rather than moving directly to combat objectives find documentation of a society operating at a level of basic functionality that the game's faction descriptions do not always fully acknowledge. The settlement at Ten Pines Bluff offers one of the game's earliest examples of the kind of small, barely surviving community that the Minutemen are supposed to protect. A handful of settlers working a patch of ground in an exposed position, with minimal defenses and an immediate need for assistance that the player can choose to address or bypass entirely. The emotional pitch of this kind of encounter, the presented need, the player's capacity to help, the low stakes but genuine human dimension, is calibrated carefully by the game to establish the Minutemen's purpose without requiring the player to feel obligated to pursue it. The settlers at Ten Pines Bluff will continue to exist in whatever state they were left in, regardless of the player's choices, their small story running in the background of the larger world, without any narrative insistence. The location of Ten Pines Bluff, on a hillside overlooking a stretch of open land, represents the kind of defensive position that small frontier communities throughout human history have chosen when available. Elevated ground provides early warning and makes approach under concealment more difficult. The settlers who chose this position clearly understood something about practical security, even without military training, and the rudimentary defenses they have managed to construct around the bluff suggest an ongoing engagement with the problem of surviving in a world that will not protect them passively. Their vulnerability, in this context, is not ignorance. It is simply insufficient resources applied to a problem that requires more than they currently have. The various workshop settlement locations available throughout the Commonwealth range from urban ruins in the middle of Diamond City's shadow to remote farmsteads far from any established community, and the diversity of their starting conditions reflects the diversity of ways that people in the post-war world have tried to establish stability. Some locations have already been settled and need only support. Others are entirely empty spaces where nothing exists yet and everything must be built. The difference between these two conditions changes the quality of what the player is doing in each location, maintenance in one case, creation in the other, and the game is thoughtful enough to vary the starting conditions widely enough that engagement with the settlement system does not become purely repetitive. The Far Harbor Island's history before the bombs fell is documented in holotapes and terminal entries scattered throughout the Dial C's locations, describing a community of fishing families and small-scale tourism that occupied a stretch of Maine coastline with deep roots and modest ambitions. The pre-war residents of Far Harbor lived lives defined by seasonal rhythms, the fishing runs, the tourist season, the particular demands of a maritime climate in a northern latitude, and the traces of these rhythms are still legible in the physical structure of the surviving buildings, if not in the population that once filled them. The fog that defines Far Harbor's atmosphere is not simply a weather condition. It is the product of radiation-altered moisture patterns that have changed the fundamental character of the island's microclimate, creating the dense, visibility-reducing murk that gives the DLC its most persistent environmental challenge and its most distinctive visual quality. Moving through the fog creates a specific kind of tension different from the open sky encounters of the Commonwealth. Enemies appear suddenly at closer range. Landmarks become unreliable guides, and the sense of being able to see what is coming is replaced by a constant awareness that the next encounter is invisible until it is immediate. The lighthouse at Far Harbor serves as both a physical landmark and a narrative anchor for the DLC's opening section, its light reaching out into the fog as a marker of the small human community clustered around the harbor. Lighthouses in general carry a particular symbolic weight. They exist to guide travelers through dangerous water, to make the presence of safety visible against the dark, and the Far Harbor lighthouses' continued operation in a world where the maritime trade routes it once served have long since ceased suggests a community maintaining something beyond its practical function, keeping a light on because the alternative is darkness, which is not a reasonable alternative. The game's treatment of pre-war Boston extends to specific real-world locations, translated faithfully enough to be recognizable. The Old State House, located in the game as a location players can explore, retains enough of its historical architecture to connect meaningfully with its real-world counterpart. The Freedom Trail, a real walking path in Boston that connects significant sites of American Revolutionary history, is replicated in the game as a quest path leading to the railroad faction's headquarters, with the trail's characteristic red line preserved in the post-war ruins as a navigational guide through the city. The choice to use this specific piece of real Boston history as the path to a faction called the Railroad, a faction devoted to the freedom of an enslaved population, is among the more pointed pieces of thematic design in the game. The Trinity Church location, based broadly on a real Boston landmark of the same name, serves as a settlement location in Fallout 4 and appears in a state of damage consistent with 2 centuries of neglect and occasional conflict. The building's structure has survived well enough to be habitable, which is consistent with the real-world building's solid construction, and the space it provides within the city makes it a strategically significant settlement location for players interested in an urban base of operations. The views from the church's higher levels across the surrounding ruins carry the specific quality of looking out from a structure that was designed to convey permanence and endurance, qualities that have outlasted every other expectation the building's original community held. The National Guard training yard is a location that rewards careful exploration for players interested in power armor and combat supplies, but its more interesting details are contained in the training documentation and personal records left behind by the soldiers who were stationed there when the bombs fell. These records describe a military establishment in its final days of functional operation, personnel on standard rotation, equipment being maintained according to normal schedules, the ordinary administration of a military training facility continuing right up to the moment when the ordinary administration of everything ceased. The gap between the routine that the records describe and the devastation visible in the environment creates a specific kind of historical vertigo, the recognition that catastrophe does not always announce itself in advance. The BADTFL Regional Office contains evidence of law enforcement activity in the final years before the war, case files, evidence logs, the administrative residue of a system that was attempting to maintain civil order in a society increasingly strained by resource shortages, political tension and the ambient awareness that something large and terrible might be coming. The cases documented in the remaining files are ordinary by the standards of pre-war crime, theft, violence, fraud, the routine categories of human misconduct, and their ordinariness is precisely what makes them affecting. The world was full of normal people doing normal things right up until it stopped being a world that could contain normal people doing normal things. The Cambridge Police Station, occupied by the Brotherhood of Steel's advance unit during the events of the game, contains its own layer of pre-war history beneath the faction's current occupation. The police department that operated here before the war left behind records and equipment that the Brotherhood has lived among without necessarily paying close attention to, and players who examine the pre-occupation evidence find a picture of a city police force dealing with the specific challenges of an urban area under increasing social pressure. The contrast between the law enforcement apparatus of the old world and the military enforcement apparatus of the Brotherhood, now occupying the same space, is another of the game's quiet observations about continuity and change. Different institutions, different purposes, but the same physical infrastructure of authority. The Sentinel site in the southwestern portion of the map, in the irradiated territory approaching the glowing sea, contains one of the game's more consequential pieces of pre-war history. The facility was designed to house and launch nuclear missiles, and the condition in which it was found by subsequent generations reflects the decisions made by the people who were present when the world ended. The scale of what the site represents, the raw infrastructure of civilizational destruction, preserved in the wasteland like a monument to the decision that defined everything that came after, gives exploration of the location a weight that most combat encounters do not carry. The issue of food production in the Commonwealth settlements is one of the game's more practical ecological observations. The soil of the post-war world is damaged, contaminated by radiation, and depleted by the combination of nuclear fallout and 2 centuries of neglect, and the crops that can be grown in it are limited to the varieties that have adapted to these conditions or been engineered to tolerate them. Mutfruit, tato plants, corn, and melons are the primary cultivatable crops available through the settlement system, each providing a specific quantity of food per plant per unit of time in the game's internal calculations. The Brahmin manure that accumulates at settlement locations where Brahmin are present serves as a fertilizer component in the game's crafting system, providing a source of nitrogen compounds that can be processed into ammunition components, among other things. This is one of the more quietly accurate pieces of agricultural logic in the game. Animal manure has been a critical fertilizer source throughout human agricultural history, and its appearance as a useful crafting material in the post-war world reflects the same practical relationship between livestock and crop production that shaped pre-industrial farming everywhere. The combination of Brahmin and mutfruit plants in a settlement design is not just aesthetically plausible, but internally logical within the game's resource economy. The water supply that settlements require is managed through wells and water purification pumps of varying output, and the quality of a settlement's water supply directly influences the health and happiness of its population in ways that the game's interface makes visible as aggregate statistics. Pure water is more valuable than irradiated water, both for consumption and as a trade commodity, and the investment in water purification infrastructure pays dividends in both settler welfare and economic terms. This creates a situation where the mundane work of infrastructure building, digging wells, running pipes, just maintaining purifiers, is genuinely consequential within the game's systems, elevating the practical management of settlement resources above purely aesthetic building choices. The weapon called the Junk Jet, a launcher that uses junk items as ammunition, is one of Fallout 4's more openly comedic mechanical designs. The weapon fires whatever junk the player loads into it as a projectile, which means that a teddy bear or a coffee mug can be turned into a genuinely damaging combat option if launched with sufficient velocity. The weapon is found in the ArcJet Systems facility and serves as evidence that the game's development team maintained a sense of humor about the junk-heavy crafting system they had built, creating a device that makes the link between the useless and the useful as literal and physical as possible. The shish kebab, a blade weapon with a fuel-fed flame running along its edge, represents the kind of improvised engineering that characterizes much wasteland weapon design. Someone built a functioning flamethrower into a melee weapon using motorcycle parts and camping fuel, and the result is impractical enough to be remarkable and effective enough to be genuinely useful in the right circumstances. The weapon type exists in previous Fallout games as well, suggesting that the design independently emerged in multiple wasteland locations, the same basic physics of fuel and blade being available in any rubble pile where certain components accumulate. The railway rifle, a weapon that fires railway spikes at high velocity using steam pressure, is another piece of improvised engineering that elevates junk to the status of legitimate armament. The spikes it fires are the same kind found scattered throughout rail yards and urban infrastructure throughout the Commonwealth, common enough to serve as a practical ammunition source for players who build around the weapon. The physics of what the weapon is doing, pressurizing steam to drive a metal spike at combat-effective velocity, are internally consistent in a way that the weapon's jury-rigged appearance might not initially suggest, and the gun occupies a particular role in the game's weapon ecosystem as an effective option that rewards engagement with the game's ecology of available materials. The art style of Fallout 4's world, the specific palette of browns, greens, and grays that define the Commonwealth's visual identity, was developed partly in response to criticism that Fallout 3's color palette was too uniformly monochromatic. The development team made a deliberate effort to introduce more variety and saturation into the post-war landscape, using vegetation that had grown back over 2 centuries of recovery and the particular quality of New England light to warm the visual register of the world. The result is a wasteland that reads as damaged and depleted without being entirely gray, a color space that communicates devastation without communicating despair in every frame. The lighting system that Fallout 4 uses to simulate time of day creates substantially different visual experiences depending on when in the in-game clock the player is exploring. Dawn produces a specific quality of pale pink and gray light that makes the ruins look almost peaceful, the colors close enough to the colors of a real New England morning to carry genuine atmospheric weight. Midday creates a cleaner, harder light that makes the damage to structures more clearly legible. Sunset produces dramatic long shadows and an orange-gold warmth that makes the Commonwealth look, for a few in-game minutes each day, like somewhere that remembers being beautiful. These transitions are not incidental. They are the product of deliberate lighting design, the same kind of attention to how light tells a story that underlies cinematography in any medium. The interior spaces of the game use a different lighting logic from the exterior, relying on point light sources, candles, lanterns, chemical lights, the glow from screens, and active machinery to create environments where light and shadow are tools for spatial definition. Well-lit areas suggest safety, or at least occupation. Dark areas suggest abandonment, or danger, or both. The Institute's immaculate fluorescent lighting is one of the strongest visual statements the game makes about the faction's character. It is the only large space in the Commonwealth where you can actually see everything clearly, which is not necessarily the same thing as being in a safe or comfortable place, and the contrast between the visual clarity and the moral complexity is one of the game's more effective environmental arguments. The personal quarters available to the sole survivor in various faction headquarters reflect the different aesthetics and priorities of each organization. The Brotherhood quarters aboard the Pridwin are institutional, functional bunks in a larger dormitory space, personal storage in lockers, the atmosphere of military accommodation rather than home. The Institute provides living quarters that are clean and well appointed by post-war standards, suggesting that the organization values the comfort of its members enough to invest in it. The Railroad's safe house environments are improvised and temporary, the aesthetic of people who have learned to move quickly and not become attached to spaces. These environmental characterizations communicate faction identity more efficiently than any amount of dialogue, and they are consistent enough across the game to feel like genuine documentation of different ways of organizing collective life. The companions who can be recruited throughout the game each claim their own piece of the Commonwealth's geography as home base before joining the player's journey. Nick Valentine operates from his detective agency in Diamond City. Piper works from the offices of public occurrences just inside Diamond City's main gate. Kate is found at the Combat Zone, a fighting arena that serves as entertainment for the Commonwealth's more aggressively inclined population. Hancock occupies the mayoral residence in Goodneighbor. Each of these starting locations tells you something about the companion before you have spoken with them, encoding their place in the world's social geography in the space they occupy and the way they relate to the community around them. The combat zone itself is one of the game's more efficiently sketched minor locations, a pre-war theater repurposed as an arena for combat entertainment, the moral ambiguity of its current function sitting uncomfortably alongside the irony of a performance space being used for the most literal possible interpretation of performance under pressure. The crowds that gather to watch combat zone fights are themselves a small piece of social documentation, evidence that even in the worst conditions, people will seek out spectacle, that entertainment is not a luxury that disappears when survival becomes difficult, but something closer to a necessity that takes whatever form is available. The relationship between the main quest and the faction storylines creates a structural tension that Fallout 4 handles with varying success across different playthroughs. The main quest's urgency, find your son, follow the trail, reach the conclusion, exists in constant implicit competition with the faction content, which asks the player to invest time and attention in organizational affiliations that may ultimately conflict with each other and with the main quest's demands. Players who attempt to maintain all faction relationships simultaneously through the mid-game eventually encounter the structural impossibility of doing so, and the point at which those relationships break is different for each faction and each set of choices. The game's ending sequences are faction-specific, and the visual and narrative differences between them communicate clearly that Bethesda considered the choice between factions a genuine thematic decision rather than a cosmetic one. The Brotherhood ending with the Pridwin dominant over the Commonwealth's skyline communicates a specific vision of order. The Institute ending communicates a different vision of technological progress. The Minutemen ending, with settlements across the Commonwealth operating independently and cooperatively, communicates something about distributed power and local self-determination that the more centralized factions cannot quite replicate. The Railroad's ending, focused narrowly on the liberation of synths, communicates the narrowest vision of the four, not a vision for the Commonwealth as a whole, but a commitment to one specific population's freedom as the most important thing. The texture of post-game exploration, the Commonwealth after all the major quests have been completed, is one of the more interesting experiences the game offers for players who choose to continue engaging with the world beyond the story's conclusion. The factions that survived are now operating in the world with whatever authority the player's choices gave them, and NPCs throughout the Commonwealth make occasional references to the changes that have occurred. Diamond City continues its daily routine. Settlers in player-built settlements continue farming and defending their walls. Nick Valentine continues taking cases from clients who find their way to his office. The world does not stop being a world simply because the main story has concluded, and the quiet persistence of its routines is among the more honest things about how Fallout 4 understands the relationship between dramatic events and ordinary life. The ArcJet Systems building sits in a part of the Commonwealth map that rewards the kind of exploration that does not follow any particular direction. The facility was a pre-war aerospace research and development company, and the evidence of its work is still present throughout the interior: rocket engine components, test bay equipment, the scale models and engineering documentation of a company that was designing propulsion systems for vehicles intended to leave the atmosphere entirely. The war interrupted this ambition at whatever stage it had reached when the bombs fell, and the resulting space is one of those Fallout 4 locations where the contrast between the ambition implied by the evidence and the condition of the present is most sharply felt. The Institute quest that brings players to ArcJet Systems involves recovering a deep-range transmitter that the faction needs for its communication systems, and the facility's connection to pre-war aerospace makes the recovered technology feel like a particularly poignant salvage operation, taking one piece of interrupted ambition and applying it to an entirely different purpose in a world that has redefined what ambitious even means. The enemies occupying ArcJet Systems at the time of the player's visit are hostile, but the building itself is not. Its architecture, its scale, its suggestion of a project that was genuinely trying to do something extraordinary before the world stopped gives it a quality distinct from pure combat locations that exist only to be cleared. The engine test chamber, deep within ArcJet Systems, is one of the more dramatically designed spaces in the game. Its enormous scale and the specific industrial aesthetics of a facility built around controlled combustion, giving it a visual weight that smaller interior spaces lack. The chamber can be activated during the quest in a way that solves a combat problem through environmental means, and the moment of engaging that system, the sound, the scale, the physics of what the chamber does to enemies positioned within it, is among the cleaner examples of environmental puzzle design in the game's midsection. The Museum of Witchcraft was operating as a tourist attraction before the war, one of those regional museums built around a specific local historical theme that exist in small New England towns with the particular earnestness of places that have decided their specific history is worth preserving and presenting to visitors. The witchcraft trials of colonial Massachusetts are real historical events, and the museum's pre-war existence as an institution devoted to presenting that history carries a layer of dark irony given what its current post-war occupant turns out to be. The Deathclaw that has made the museum its territory is simply the most recent and largest in a long succession of things that have frightened people in this space. The holotape that can be found in the museum's upper levels describes the events that led to the current state of the space from the perspective of a soldier who entered the building in search of shelter and found something waiting for him. The tape is one of the game's better short-form horror narratives, using sound and pacing and the specific texture of first-person recorded experience to build tension through description rather than direct depiction. Players who find and listen to it before encountering the museum's current occupant will experience that encounter differently than players who stumble into it without context, which is the kind of sequential discovery that the best environmental storytelling in open-world games produces. The mannequins throughout the museum are posed in ways that capitalize on the pre-war exhibit context, their arrangements suggesting both their original curatorial purpose and their current quality as unsettling visual noise in a dark and ambiguous space. Mannequins in Fallout 4 carry their own specific dread because the game occasionally moves them between player visits to a location, a scripted behavior designed to produce exactly the response that unplanned changes to a familiar space produce in the human nervous system. Whether any specific mannequin has moved when you were not watching is something the game never confirms and never denies. The Boston Airport settlement, available to players allied with the Brotherhood of Steel, occupies a space that communicates the faction's sensibility more efficiently than most of their dialogue. An airport, a place built for arrivals and departures, for movement between places, for the particular modern faith that distance can be made irrelevant through engineering, repurposed as a military installation and settlement, its runways now serving as landing zones for vertibirds rather than commercial aircraft. The infrastructure of civilian travel quietly converted to institutional purpose. The Brotherhood did not choose this location by accident. They chose the most logistically capable site near the center of the Commonwealth and made it theirs with the confidence of an organization that has never seriously considered the possibility that it might not be welcome. The settlement at Boston Airport can be developed with the full workshop system, and players who invest in it find that the existing airport infrastructure provides unusually strong building foundations. The runways and terminal structures were built to handle heavy traffic and significant weather events, and their bones are more substantial than most settlement spaces offer. The terminal building retains enough of its pre-war architecture to be recognizable as a place that once processed thousands of travelers each day, and the contrast between that institutional capacity and the improvised settlement functions it now serves is another of those architectural arguments about continuity and change that the game makes through space rather than words. The air traffic control tower at the airport, if explored fully, contains documentation of the final hours of the facility's operation before the bombs fell. Flight logs, weather data, the routine administrative record of a busy transportation hub, all ending mid-sentence in some cases as the operators of those systems processed the news that was coming toward them. The specific date and time of the last entry before the silence is something the game presents without comment, letting the gap between that last recorded moment and the present state of the building speak for itself. The Corvega assembly plant has a particular place in the broader cultural geography of the Commonwealth because of the car model it was built to produce. Corvega was the fictional automotive brand that Bethesda developed as part of the Fallout universe's pre-war consumer culture, and the Corvega cars that appear throughout the Commonwealth as debris and obstacle and occasional loot are consistently styled in the visual language of late 1950s American car design, long, wide, chrome-decorated, built with the assumption that fuel would always be cheap and that impressive scale was a virtue in itself. The model at the assembly plant was one of the more practical Corvega designs, and the unfinished frames still on the production line suggest a vehicle that would have been genuinely appealing to pre-war consumers if the bombs had waited a few more weeks. The Raider faction that occupies the Corvega plant has made extensive use of the facility's industrial infrastructure as both defense and decoration. Vehicles have been repurposed as barriers. The production equipment has been modified in various improvised ways to serve the needs of a community that is organized around territory and aggression rather than manufacturing. The resulting environment is a layered space where the original industrial purpose is still legible beneath the accumulated customization of 2 centuries of opportunistic occupation, and moving through it requires reading both layers simultaneously to understand the full picture of where you are. The view from the highest accessible point of the Corvega plant provides one of the game's better early game panoramas, giving players who have reached it a view of the surrounding Commonwealth that puts several major locations into geographic relationship with each other. Lexington is visible below and around the plant. The Boston skyline is visible in the distance. The landscape between those points is laid out in a way that makes the scale of the wasteland concrete. These are not small spaces separated by loading screens, but a continuous geography that exists whether or not the player is moving through it. The Vault Tech Workshop DLC added the ability to construct and populate an entirely new vault from scratch within the game's settlement system, Vault 88, accessible through a specific cave system in the Commonwealth. The DLC introduced vault-specific building components that allowed players to design the interior of their vault with the same distinctive architectural vocabulary that characterizes every vault in the game, creating a space that looked authentically like a Vault Tech installation, rather than simply a standard settlement placed underground. The morally complex component of the Vault Tech Workshop DLC involves the option to run actual experiments on the settlers who come to live in the vault. The DLC provides the mechanics to design and implement experiments of the kind that Vault Tech ran in its canonical vaults, putting the player in the position of the overseer who chooses what will be done to the people who trusted their vault for safety. Players can choose benign experiments or genuinely harmful ones, and the game tracks the moral weight of these choices through companion reactions and settlement happiness outcomes. The DLC essentially asks the player whether they would make the same choices that Vault Tech made, and some players find the question more uncomfortable than they expected. The backstory of Vault 88 is that it was still under construction when the bombs fell. The vault was not completed in time to receive the population it was designed for, and the entrance cavern contains the evidence of a construction project interrupted at various stages of completion. This incomplete state is what makes the vault available as a player-constructed space rather than a pre-designed institutional ruin, and the fiction of building out what was never finished sits well with the game's broader treatment of the Commonwealth as a place where the interrupted projects of the old world are always waiting for someone to decide what to do with them. The Nuka World Raider factions, the Operators, the Disciples, and the Pack, each bring a distinct culture and aesthetic to the park's occupied zones. The Operators are professional and businesslike in their approach to raiding, treating it as an enterprise to be optimized rather than a pure expression of aggression. The Disciples are characterized by an intensity that is more theatrical and more personally invested in violence as an end in itself. The Pack have organized their identity around a particular relationship with the park's mutated animal population, incorporating creature characteristics into their visual presentation and operational approach. The three factions coexist in uneasy balance within Nuka World, and the player's choices about how to manage that balance drive the DLC's central narrative. The story of how Nuka World came to be under Raider control is documented in the terminal entries and holotapes scattered throughout the park's various zones, describing a process that unfolded over years rather than through a single conquest. Successive waves of wasteland travelers found their way to the park, some drawn by its pre-war reputation, some simply following rumors of shelter and resources. The community that formed around the park was initially more mixed in its composition before the balance tipped toward the current Raider-dominated configuration, and the records of that earlier period have a quality of something lost, a community that might have been something different if the balance of power had settled differently. The animatronic characters and automated entertainers that are still functioning throughout Nuka World are among the more unsettling environmental elements in the DLC, their pre-war cheerfulness operating without interruption, regardless of the transformed reality of the space around them. A mascot character delivering scripted promotional lines about the wonderful day visitors are having while raiders move through the frame in the background is the kind of juxtaposition that Fallout manages better than perhaps any other game series. The gap between the world as it was designed to be presented and the world as it actually turned out is a space the franchise has always inhabited with particular skill. The Nuka-Cola Corporation's advertising presence throughout the Commonwealth, and especially in Nuka World, reveals a pre-war marketing operation of remarkable scope and sophistication. Every zone of Nuka World was originally themed around a different Nuka-Cola flavor variant: Nuka Cherry, Nuka-Cola Quantum, Nuka Wild, Nuka Void, and the visual identity of each zone was developed with the kind of thematic coherence that major corporate entertainment brands bring to their physical spaces. The investment implied by the infrastructure of Nuka World is staggering even in its current ruined state, suggesting a company that believed its brand was substantial enough to justify the construction of an entire theme park as an extended advertisement. Nuka-Cola Quantum, the luminescent blue variant of the standard product, was the company's premium offering in the years before the war, distinguishing itself from regular Nuka-Cola through both its distinctive visual presentation and its significantly higher price point. The product's glow came from a small amount of strontium added to the formula, an element that is mildly radioactive, which adds a specific layer of dark irony to the premium pricing, and the resulting drink was marketed as a luxury experience. Players who find and consume Nuka-Cola Quantum in the game receive a more significant temporary boost to action points than standard Nuka-Cola provides, making the premium branding internally consistent with the gameplay mechanics. The Nuka-Cola vending machines that appear throughout the Commonwealth and in concentrated numbers throughout Nuka World operate on a restocking schedule that the game runs in the background, meaning that machines found empty on one visit will sometimes contain bottles on a subsequent visit if enough in-game time has passed. This is one of the more quietly logical pieces of resource management in the game's economy, suggesting a distribution infrastructure that somehow continues to function in some minimal capacity, even 200 years after the company that built it ceased to exist as an operating entity. Where the restocked bottles come from is one of those questions the game declines to answer directly. The Valentine Detective Agency's sign that hangs above Nick Valentine's office in Diamond City is one of the more aesthetically considered pieces of environmental branding in the game. The font, the design sensibility, the particular quality of neon sign aesthetics from the mid-20th century, all of these choices place Nick visually within a specific tradition of American detective fiction that the game is deliberately invoking. Nick Valentine is Fallout 4's homage to the hard-boiled detective archetype, a genre figure transplanted into a post-apocalyptic context with enough care for the source material that the transplant feels genuine rather than merely referential. Nick's cases, available as side quests through his agency, are structured in the episodic format of detective fiction. A client arrives with a problem, an investigation is conducted, evidence is gathered and interpreted, a conclusion is reached. The cases are not as tonally dark as the genre they reference would typically support, but they do carry a consistent quality of attention to the specific texture of pre-war and post-war Boston that makes them feel grounded rather than generic. Nick's commentary on the cases as they develop is among the better companion dialogue in the game, reflecting a character whose experience of the world is genuinely broader and stranger than most of the people around him. The file cabinet in Nick's office contains active case materials, notes on ongoing investigations, client communications, the administrative residue of a working detective business operating in genuinely difficult conditions. Players who take the time to read through the materials find evidence of a practice that has been running for a considerable time, serving the residents of Diamond City and the wider Commonwealth with a consistency that speaks well of both Nick's professional commitment and the community's willingness to engage with an institution operated by someone who is visibly not entirely human. The Diamond City accepts Nick as a functioning member of the community while simultaneously harboring deep suspicion of synths in general, is one of the subtler observations the game makes about how proximity and familiarity change the terms of acceptance. The weather and time cycle of the Commonwealth produces specific moments of atmospheric beauty that players who spend enough time in the wasteland will eventually encounter naturally. A radiation storm seen from inside a well-defended shelter, the green-tinged light filtering through broken windows, the specific quality of the sound outside, creates a completely different experience from being caught in one in the open. The transition from storm to clear, the gradual shift in light quality as the radiation dissipates and normal weather reasserts itself, is one of those time-lapse moments that the game renders with more care than the practical requirements of the gameplay would strictly demand. The aurora-like visual effect that sometimes appears in the Northern Commonwealth sky during clear nights is a detail that many players do not encounter simply because the combination of clear weather and nighttime play in an elevated enough position to see the horizon clearly is not a combination that any particular quest requires. Players who find a high enough vantage point on a clear night and look north sometimes see a faint curtain of light above the horizon, an effect that has no lore explanation within the game and that exists, apparently, simply because someone on the environment team thought it was worth including. It serves no function. It advances nothing. It is simply there for the players who happen to be in the right place at the right time, looking in the right direction. The day-night cycle in Fallout 4 runs at a compression of approximately 24:1, meaning that each real-world minute of play corresponds to approximately 24 minutes of in-game time. The practical effect of this compression is that the full day-night cycle completes roughly every hour of real-world play, cycling the Commonwealth through morning, midday, afternoon, evening, night, and back to morning with enough frequency that players who explore for extended sessions will experience multiple full cycles during a single session. The rhythm of this cycling, the gradual shift from one quality of light to another, the changes in ambient sound that accompany the transition between day and night, creates a persistent background sense of time's passage that open-world games without this feature often lack. The interiors of the subway tunnels that run beneath Boston represent a distinct ecosystem within the Commonwealth. The tunnels are flooded in places, collapsed in others, and occupied throughout by a population of feral ghouls who have been living in the dark for 200 years. The transit system they inhabit was once the backbone of Boston's urban transportation network, and the evidence of its former function, the platform signs, the fare machines, the transit maps still fixed to the walls in spots where they have survived, gives the underground spaces a documentary quality that more purpose-built dungeon interiors do not always achieve. The specific subway lines visible in the game correspond to real lines in the Boston Metropolitan Transit System: the green line, the red line, the blue line, with enough geographic accuracy that players familiar with real Boston Transit can orient themselves within the game's underground spaces by reading the destination signs at each platform. The transfer points between lines correspond to real transfer stations, and the particular geography of which lines cross reflects the actual structure of the Boston subway system rather than a simplified fictional approximation. This level of geographic accuracy in the underground spaces mirrors the attention paid to surface geography, suggesting that the research conducted for the above-ground world was applied consistently to the spaces beneath it. The ghouls who inhabit the subway tunnels represent the longest established population of any hostile group in the Commonwealth. Their 200-year residence underground has produced communities, in the loosest biological sense, that have persisted across multiple generations of ghoul lifespans if ghouls do indeed have variable lifespans, and the density of ghoul population in certain tunnel sections suggests that the underground spaces have been continuously occupied since shortly after the bombs fell. The conditions of the tunnels, dark, enclosed, isolated from the surface world, full of the residual infrastructure of the pre-war city, have shaped the ghoul population of the Boston Underground into the particular form it takes in the game, which is to say feral and aggressive, and almost entirely without the individual personality that non-feral ghouls retain. The distinction between feral and non-feral ghouls is one of the game's more carefully maintained biological distinctions. Non-feral ghouls, like Hancock and the ghoul residents of various Commonwealth settlements, retain full cognitive function and personality despite the radiation-induced transformation of their physical appearance. Feral ghouls have undergone a further neurological change that has stripped away higher cognitive function, leaving them with the aggression and endurance of radiation exposure without the personality or reasoning capacity that made them individuals. What causes this second transition, what tips a non-feral ghoul toward the feral state, is something the game's lore suggests is related to continued radiation exposure and psychological stress, but the precise mechanism is never fully established. Hancock's own backstory involves a pre-war identity as a petty criminal and general troublemaker who became a ghoul through circumstances he describes with characteristic understatement. His transformation did not strip away his personality. He is one of the more distinctive personalities in the entire companion roster, but it did change his relationship to his own mortality in ways that inform his philosophical outlook and his governance approach in Good Neighbor. Hancock's politics, such as they are, seem to be organized around the principle that having lost one kind of humanity, he is not particularly interested in enforcing conventional definitions of it on anyone else. The ghoul community of Good Neighbor is one of the more notable pieces of social geography in the Commonwealth, a settlement that has become a home for the people and creatures that Diamond City's policies excluded. The concentration of ghouls, robots, and morally unconventional humans in Good Neighbor creates a community with a specific character, tolerant of difference because its members have all experienced the consequences of intolerance and organized around the practical reality of coexistence rather than the theoretical principles of any particular social ideology. It is not a utopia. It is a place where people who had nowhere else particularly welcoming to go have decided to make something work, which is perhaps the most realistic description of how communities actually form. The Cabot House questline introduces a family of pre-war Bostonians who have survived into the post-war era through means that are never entirely straightforward. The Cabots are connected to a much older and stranger story than most of Fallout 4's character histories involve, and the questline that develops around them has a tone that is deliberately different from the game's main narrative, more intimate, more focused on a small family's extraordinary circumstances, less interested in the large-scale political questions that drive the faction content. The house itself, in one of Boston's wealthier pre-war neighborhoods, has been maintained with enough care to remain genuinely habitable, which is immediately distinctive in a game where most surviving structures are in various states of advanced deterioration. The serum that drives the Cabot questline is one of Fallout 4's more overtly unusual MacGuffins, a substance whose properties are explained in terms that deliberately mix the scientific and the inexplicable in ways that the game never fully resolves into either category. Whether the serum represents pre-war scientific achievement, something stranger, or a combination of both is ultimately left to interpretation, and the Cabot family's own relationship to the substance is one of the questline's more psychologically interesting elements. They are simultaneously dependent on it, frightened of it, and deeply ambivalent about what it says about them that they need it to continue existing as they are. The locked room in Cabot House, accessible only at a specific point in the quest line, contains evidence of the family's research and history that retroactively recontextualizes everything visible in the house's public areas. This kind of delayed revelation, the information needed to understand what you are looking at, is only available after you have spent time with the space, is a structuring device that Fallout 4 uses more consistently than its reputation for straightforward narrative sometimes suggests, rewarding players who return to earlier locations with new context rather than treating all areas as single-visit experiences. The Pikmin Gallery is one of the Commonwealth's more carefully constructed horror set pieces, a building whose exterior offers no particular warning about what the interior contains and whose interior unfolds its particular quality of dread through accumulation rather than shock. The gallery was operated by an artist named Pikmin before becoming what it currently is, and the relationship between what an art gallery is supposed to be, a space for the contemplative encounter with beauty and craft, and what this one has become is one of those juxtapositions that the game handles without commentary, trusting the player to draw their own conclusions. Okay. The paintings that Pikmin created and that are still displayed throughout the gallery are described in terms that suggest genuine artistic skill applied to subject matter that most viewers would find difficult. The game never renders the paintings in enough detail to make their content explicit, but the descriptions available through terminal entries and the reactions of NPCs who discuss them provide enough information to form an impression of someone whose relationship to the boundary between art and something else has been thoroughly dissolved. Pikmin himself is encountered alive in the lower levels of the gallery, and the moral question his presence poses, what to do about a person who is genuinely skilled at something genuinely terrible, is one the game leaves to the player without providing a clear recommended answer. The raiders who have occupied the gallery during the events of the game have come there for reasons that the evidence does not make entirely clear, but their occupation of the space has created a situation where multiple sets of danger are present simultaneously. Players who enter the gallery encounter both raiders and something else that neither they nor the raiders anticipated finding in the building's lower levels, and the way the two threats interact, each serving to complicate the other, creates a combat scenario with more moving parts than most locations in the game contain. The Yangtze submarine, sitting in Boston Harbor, is one of the more surprising discoveries available to players who explore the harbor area thoroughly. The vessel is a Chinese submarine that was in the area when the bombs fell, and its crew, one surviving officer of sorts, has been waiting aboard the vessel since the war ended. The encounter raises questions about the experience of time and waiting that the game's main narrative also circles around, but from a perspective that inverts the sole survivor's situation, where the sole survivor was frozen through the intervening centuries and experienced no passage of time. The Yangtze's remaining crew member has experienced 200 years in real time, and what that duration has done to him is written in every piece of dialogue available in the encounter. The submarine itself is navigable in its interior, a cramped metal space designed for the specific functional purposes of a military vessel rather than for any comfort or spaciousness. The crew quarters, the navigation systems, the weapons bay, all of these spaces communicate the engineering philosophy of a military that was preparing for a very specific kind of conflict and designed everything around operational efficiency. The contrast between the Japanese-influenced aesthetic of the Fallout universe's pre-war Chinese military equipment and the American aesthetic of most other military hardware in the game gives the submarine a visual distinctiveness that makes exploring its interior a genuinely different experience from most other military locations in the Commonwealth. The mission that the Yangtze encounter eventually develops into involves recovering components that the submarine needs to complete its original mission, a mission whose relevance has obviously long since expired, but whose completion has become a kind of psychological necessity for the crew member who has been waiting to complete it for 2 centuries. The game treats this situation with a specific kind of compassion that does not require the player to endorse the original mission's purpose, recognizing that the need to complete something one was designed and trained and committed to completing can outlast the context that made that thing make sense, and that there is something worth treating gently in that kind of trapped purposefulness. The USS Constitution, a pre-war warship converted into a settlement through a remarkable sequence of events that most players encounter as an amusing side story, sits in the northeastern section of the Commonwealth map on a course toward a destination it will never quite reach. The ship's robot crew has been maintaining and attempting to fly it for reasons that have become somewhat detached from their original orders, and the quest attached to the ship involves resolving a conflict between the robotic crew and a group of raiders who have boarded the vessel. The resolution options include helping the ship complete a version of its intended journey, which does not end where the crew expects it to, but which the game frames with enough gentle humor that the unexpected destination lands as a comic beat rather than a tragic one. The ship's interior is one of the game's more distinctive environmental designs, a wooden-hulled warship from a much earlier era of naval history, maintained and retrofitted with technology that spans several centuries of development, operated by robots whose programming reflects the military conventions of a period 200 years before the game is set. The combination produces a space with a temporal layering unusual, even by the standards of the Commonwealth's general tendency toward anachronism, and exploring it produces the specific pleasure of an environment that follows its own internal logic with complete seriousness, regardless of how that logic might appear from the outside. The captain of the USS Constitution, an Ahab unit named Ironsides, is one of the game's more memorably characterized robots, not a major character in any narrative sense, but someone whose limited operating parameters have been exceeded by centuries of maintenance and command responsibility in ways that have produced something resembling genuine personality. His commitment to the ship and its crew is total and sincere, and the way it expresses itself through a military formality that has outlasted every original context for that formality by 200 years gives him a specific quality of dignified persistence that makes the encounter more affecting than its comedic framing might initially suggest. The spectral nature of certain Commonwealth locations, the places that exist as traces of lives rather than as living spaces, is perhaps most concentrated in the general area of the pre-war suburbs, north and west of Boston. Sanctuary Hills, Jamaica Plain, the neighborhoods that were once ordinary residential spaces, all carry a specific quality of frozen ordinariness that the game's more dramatic locations do not share. The drama of the Institute or the Brotherhood is expressed through the scale and organization of purpose-built spaces. The drama of a suburban kitchen with a box of cereal on the table and a child's baseball glove on the counter is expressed through the suggestion of a life interrupted rather than a life lived for power or ideology. Jamaica Plain, specifically, is a location that has developed a reputation among Commonwealth travelers for containing extraordinary hidden wealth, a legend that has made it one of the more dangerous locations in the game simply because rumors of treasure attract dangerous people. The reality of what is actually found at the end of Jamaica Plain's dungeon sequence is one of the game's quieter jokes, a genuine surprise that recontextualizes what treasure means in a world that has been operating under post-war values for 2 centuries, and that the game delivers with a patience born of the confidence that the setup is good enough to land, despite however long it has taken to reach the punchline. The pre-war homes in Jamaica Plain and the surrounding residential areas contain the same personal documentary evidence as Sanctuary Hills: the photographs, the personal items, the small evidence of individual lives. But without the specific narrative weight of the sole survivor's personal connection to Sanctuary, Jamaica Plain's residents were simply people who lived in a neighborhood, and their traces are the traces of ordinary lives lived without any particular historical distinction. The scale of the loss recorded in those ordinary objects is, in its way, more comprehensive than the loss recorded in any monument or memorial, simply because it is so thoroughly ordinary. The various companion-specific perks that unlock at maximum affinity are among the more creatively designed mechanical rewards in the game, each reflecting something specific about the companion who grants them. The Lone Wanderer perk, unlocked through dog meat, reduces the carry weight penalty normally applied when traveling without a companion, suggesting that the bond between the player and the dog is substantial enough to count as companionship even by the game's mechanical definitions. Strong's perk, Berserk, increases melee damage when health is low. Deacon's perk, located at the intersection of his spy background and his experience with railroad operations, increases the effectiveness of certain stealth approaches. Each perk is legible as a character statement as well as a mechanical benefit, which is the mark of design work that has integrated story and system rather than running them in parallel. Dogmeat himself is one of the game's most carefully maintained characters, in the sense that his presence and behavior are consistent enough to produce genuine attachment, even from players who are not especially invested in the narrative dimensions of their companions. The dog's responses to exploration, sniffing at objects of interest, reacting to enemies before the player character has detected them, sitting patiently when the player is engaged in activities that require human-level interaction, give him a behavioral range that feels appropriate to his animal nature, rather than being a simplified simulation of it. Players who invest in Dogmeat's company across a full playthrough tend to emerge from that playthrough with specific memories of the dog's behavior in particular situations, which is the mark of a companion character whose design has succeeded in the specific way that matters most. The cat that lives in Diamond City, a striped tabby that can be found sleeping in various spots throughout the settlement with the specific quality of indifference that cats bring to any environment they occupy, is one of the game's least prominent residents and one of its most beloved. The cat has no name in the game's data, no quest associated with it, no dialogue that acknowledges it, and no function in any mechanical system. It simply lives in Diamond City, sleeping in the sun where there is sun, and moving with the unhurried confidence of an animal that has never fully accepted the premise that the world ended. Players who find it tend to return to check on it on subsequent visits, which is perhaps the most efficient possible measure of how effective the game is at making its small inhabitants feel real. The sole survivor's backstory as a pre-war veteran is reflected in certain aspects of the character's default capabilities and the specific way the game frames the learning curve of the early game. Someone who served in the military and survived combat before the war would already know how to handle weapons, how to move through dangerous terrain, how to assess threats, and make tactical decisions under pressure. The game does not spend significant time on these competencies because the character arrived at the beginning of play already possessing them, which means that the early game's apparent learning curve is framed within the fiction as a process of readjustment rather than initial acquisition. The sole survivor is not learning to fight. They are remembering how. The specific military unit and campaign details of the sole survivor's service are touched on but not exhaustively documented within the game's narrative. References to the Anchorage campaign, the military operation to recapture Alaska from Chinese forces that forms the backdrop of the Fallout 3 DLC Operation Anchorage, place the sole survivor within a specific historical context of the pre-war military effort. Whether the characters served in Alaska specifically or in other theaters of the resource war is left open to the player's interpretation, and the game's dialogue options allow for a range of specific claims about military experience without mandating any single definitive history. The pre-war military uniform found in certain locations throughout the Commonwealth and identifiable as being from the era of the sole survivor's service carries its own kind of documentary weight. The equipment used by soldiers in the final years before the bombs fell was at a specific stage of technological development, more advanced than mid-20th century gear in some respects, constrained by others, and the particular design language of that equipment reflects the Fallout universe's consistent aesthetic of retrofuturism, technologies that developed in parallel with but differently from the real-world trajectory, producing results that are recognizable in outline, but strange in their specific execution. The Quincy ruins in the Southern Commonwealth represent one of the game's more significant pieces of recent wasteland history, a settlement that was destroyed not by the initial catastrophe of the war, but by the more recent and more human catastrophe of betrayal and abandonment. The Minutemen suffered a defining defeat at Quincy, and the physical evidence of that defeat is still present in the ruins. The defensive positions that were not enough, the evidence of the civilian population that was depending on a defense that failed to materialize. The story of what happened at Quincy is available through holotapes and terminal entries, and it provides the specific historical context for Preston Garvey's exhausted determination and his careful wariness about who can be trusted to do what they promise. The gunners who currently occupy Quincy have made it one of their most substantial fortifications in the Commonwealth, suggesting that the location's defensive geography, the elevated positions, the choke points, the proximity to certain supply routes, continues to be as strategically valuable as it was when the Minutemen chose it as a defensible position. The irony of a location being well chosen as a defensive site by a community that was then destroyed at that site, followed by occupation by a mercenary group that sees and exploits the same strategic virtues, is the kind of detail that gives the Commonwealth's geography a sense of history that most game maps do not manage. The ghost of the Quincy Minutemen garrison persists in the space in the form of personal effects and records that the gunners have not bothered to clear away. Players who take the time to read through these documents encounter the individual voices of people who believed their defense would hold, who were maintaining hope longer than the outcome justified, and whose final communications are marked by the specific quality of someone trying to hold a reasonable assessment of a situation that is moving beyond what reason can contain. The contrast between the bureaucratic language of Minutemen organizational communication and the emotional reality visible beneath it is among the more effective pieces of understated writing in the game. The Nuka-Cola mountain range of flavors introduced in Nuka World, Nuka Sunrise, Nuka Punch, Nuka Love, represents the company's approach to regional market differentiation, developing flavor profiles intended to appeal to different demographic segments while maintaining the core brand identity that made Nuka-Cola the dominant soft drink in the pre-war world. Each flavor variant has a distinct color scheme and marketing vocabulary, and the vending machines and advertising throughout Nuka World reflect the investment the company made in presenting these variants as premium experiences rather than simply product extensions. The chemistry of Nuka-Cola's various flavor variants was never entirely straightforward in pre-war terms, and the specific ingredients that give each variant its distinctive properties are documented in laboratory records throughout the Nuka World facilities. The Nuka-Cola quantum formula, as noted, includes strontium in small quantities. a detail that appears in the official product documentation with a blandness suggesting that the company's regulatory relationship with its ingredient sourcing was, at minimum, flexible. Other variants include compounds that in more regulated contexts might have required more prominent labeling, suggesting that the pre-war Nuka-Cola Corporation operated within a regulatory environment that was either particularly permissive or particularly well managed from a public relations perspective. The Nuka-Cola mascot, a rocket ship that appears on the company's primary branding, connects the beverage to the space-age optimism that defined a certain strain of pre-war American cultural ambition, the belief that technological progress was pointing outward and upward, that the frontier was not the horizon, but the stars beyond it. This optimism is one of the pre-war world's most significant cultural characteristics, the confidence that improvement was always possible, that the future would always be better, that the arc of progress bent consistently toward wonder. The bombs fall into the silence of that confidence, and the ruins of the world that believed it are what the Commonwealth is made from. The Vault Tech regional offices, scattered throughout Boston, contain documentation of the sales and enrollment process that filled the vaults with their experimental populations. Representatives were assigned territories and given quotas, and the records of their interactions with potential vault residents have a quality of ordinary commercial persuasion that makes the stakes involved in their work almost invisible from the perspective of the salespeople conducting it. They were selling survival packages, and their pitch materials were organized around the features and benefits of each vault offering, the way any salesperson in any industry organizes a presentation around what the product provides to the customer. The detail that most of the vault salespeople appear not to have known the full experimental purpose of the facilities they were selling is both credible and convenient. Credible because large organizations routinely distribute information selectively, and convenient because it allows the human dimension of the sales operation to be separated from the institutional purpose that the sales operation served. Whether the individual Vault Tech representatives who knocked on doors in the final weeks before the war and convinced families to sign enrollment forms were complicit in what happened to those families is a question about institutional responsibility and individual knowledge that the game raises through its documentation and declines to resolve through its narrative. The enrollment data preserved in various Vault Tech terminals throughout the Commonwealth includes the names and biographical details of residents who never made it to their designated vaults, people whose enrollment paperwork exists but whose names appear in no vault's resident records. These are the people who were caught outside when the bombs fell, who chose not to report to their vault on the day, or who were too far away, or whose vault entrance was inaccessible when the sirens sounded. The gap between enrollment and residence in the surviving data is a census of absence, a record of the people for whom the Vault Tech system represented a contingency that never became necessary until the day it was too late to access it. These are the notes the Commonwealth plays when nobody is listening for a melody. The detail on the underside of a coffee mug. The faces inside a lunchbox nobody was meant to look inside. The single climbable ladder in a lair full of robots, existing because someone placed a prop and forgot to remove its interaction property. The raven on a ruined wall, watching with eyes that report back to a fluorescent room underground. The preserved pie in the only diner that will ever give it to you, waiting across 2 centuries for someone patient enough to find it. None of these things change anything important. None of them shift the balance of power between factions or alter the course of the main quest or determine whether the Commonwealth survives to become something worth the surviving. They are the decorations on a world that was built with enormous effort and occasional love, the small personal marks that the people who made the Commonwealth left behind when the cameras were not focused on the important scenes. And perhaps that is the most useless and most essential thing about Fallout 4 that buried underneath all of its conflict and history and philosophical weight, it is also a world that someone cared about in the small ways, filled with details that no quest log points toward and no achievement rewards finding. The wasteland is full of things nobody planted flags on, and part of what makes it feel like a place rather than a level is that those things are simply quietly there. The memory of the Commonwealth continues long after the credits have run. Not the battles and the faction endings and the conclusions of the major quests, though those stay too in their way, but the specific texture of particular moments, the quality of light through a broken window in an abandoned house, the sound of Diamond City radio drifting through the static, the shape of a skeleton in a recliner with its patient stillness, the suggestion of a life that was ordinary and real and ended in an ordinary chair with the same magazines within reach that had always been within reach. These are the things that make a world feel lived in rather than only designed. Not the architecture of the grand structures, but the clutter of the small spaces. Not the sweep of the history, but the particular note of the individual. Whoever left the letter unsent, whoever sat down in the chapel and received a small blessing of experience, whoever climbed to the roof of mass fusion and stood there for a moment, looking out over a city that still had its skyline, even with all the rest of it gone. The Commonwealth is broken and beautiful and full of things that do not matter, and the things that do not matter are very often the things worth finding. The world keeps its small secrets with the same patience it keeps everything else, 200 years, quietly, with a radiation glow that looks almost like warmth if you catch it from the right angle at the right time of morning, when the fog has lifted and the pre-war songs are playing and the wasteland is just, for a moment, somewhere you chose to be. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through this gentle story, another video is waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play softly beside you. You may drift into sleep while something new unfolds.